The two security guards didn't knock. They positioned themselves on either side of the nurse's station at 5:47 in the morning and waited until the charge nurse looked up. She was 62 years old, had worked this floor for 3 decades, and the badge clipped to her scrub pocket had more scan history logged into Vantage General's system than anyone else on staff. She looked at the guards, then at the administrator standing 10 feet behind them with his arms crossed, and she understood immediately what was happening. She set down her pen. She reached up and unclipped the badge with one hand. She placed it on the counter without a word, and every phone in that corridor came out before she reached the elevator. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me until the end. Hit like, hit follow, and drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The morning shift at Vantage General Hospital in Delwood, Oregon didn't usually carry weight. Most days it was the same rhythm. The elevator banks opening and closing, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the low hum of monitors filtering out from behind curtained bays. The cafeteria started its coffee rotation at 5:30. The parking garage filled in predictable waves. It was the kind of hospital that ran on routine. And routine was something charge nurse Margaret Oakes had spent 31 years building into the bones of the third-floor cardiac and trauma unit. She wasn't supposed to be there that morning. That was the first thing people got wrong when they started telling the story later. They assumed she'd come in for her regular shift. She hadn't. Margaret's shift had ended at 11 the previous night. She'd stayed because a patient coded at 10:50, a 29-year-old veteran named Darius Webb, who'd come in through the ER with what the intake form described as general fatigue and elevated heart rate, which turned out to be catastrophically incomplete. By the time the on-call physician had reviewed the case, Webb's pressure had dropped, and his rhythm was doing something on the monitor that the overnight resident hadn't seen before and couldn't name. Margaret had seen it before. She'd named it in her head before the resident finished talking, and she stayed. She wasn't supposed to stay. Hospital policy under Director of Clinical Operations Roland Fitch was explicit. Overtime without pre-authorization triggered a review process that Fitch had personally implemented 2 years earlier after a budget restructuring. Nobody on the nursing floor had missed the implication. The policy was enforced selectively. Margaret had noticed. She stayed anyway because Darius Webb was 29 years old and his rhythm was wrong and the resident's hands were shaking. By 2 in the morning, Webb was stable. By 5:30, Margaret was sitting at the nurse's station writing up her notes from the overnight intervention, a cup of cooling coffee beside her keyboard, when she heard the footsteps coming down the corridor that didn't belong to anyone on shift. She looked up and found Roland Fitch. He wasn't in scrubs. He was in his administrative clothes, pressed slacks, a collared shirt, the kind of outfit that said he hadn't been called in but had chosen to come in, which was different and more deliberate. Behind him, 2 of the hospital's private security personnel moved into position on either side of the station with the practiced spacing of people who had done this before. Margaret set her pen down. "Mr. Fitch," she said. Her voice was even. She'd trained herself a long time ago to keep her voice even when her chest was doing something else entirely. "Ms. Oakes." He didn't use her title. She noticed that. "I think you know why I'm here. You want to talk about last night?" "I want to talk about a pattern." He moved closer, stopping on the other side of the counter, and the way he held himself, the slight forward lean, the deliberate eye contact, told her he'd rehearsed this. "You stayed 4 hours past the end of your authorized shift without submitting a request. That's not the first time. That's a protocol violation. And in this facility, protocol violations carry consequences." "Darius Webb is alive," Margaret said. "That's not the point. It's the only point." Something shifted in Fitch's expression. Not anger exactly, but the particular tension of a man who'd expected this to go differently and was recalibrating. He'd worked at Vantage General for 3 years, which meant he'd overlapped with Margaret for 3 years. And in that time, she had been a persistent, low-grade problem for him. Not insubordinate, not technically. She followed procedures, documented everything, passed every review. But she had a way of existing in this hospital that made certain people uncomfortable. The kind of competence that doesn't perform itself, that just sits there being real, that makes people around it either better or more defensive depending on their nature. Fitch was the second kind. "You've been a valued employee," he said, and the word valued landed like a door closing. but the decision has been made at the administrative level. Based on your repeated pattern of unauthorized overtime and what I'll describe as a consistent difficulty working within our updated operational framework. Darius Webb coded at 10:50 last night, Margaret said. She wasn't raising her voice. His QRS complex was showing Brugada pattern changes that the resident on call had not encountered in a clinical setting. I stayed because leaving at that moment would have been a different kind of violation. That is a clinical judgment call that is above your pay grade, Ms. Oakes. Vatten. 3 nurses had drifted to the edges of the corridor now. Margaret could see them in her peripheral vision. Keisha, from nights, 2-day shift nurses who'd just come up from the locker room. Nobody was speaking. Everybody was watching. "Turn in your badge," Fitch said. "You're done here." The corridor went very quiet. Margaret looked at him for a moment. There were things she could have said. She was aware of that with a strange clarity, like standing at a high window and knowing the distance to the ground. She could have said she had documentation of every overtime hour and the clinical necessity attached to each one. She could have said she knew about the incident from 8 months ago when Fitch had pressured the previous charge nurse off the floor after a dispute over his restructuring plan, and that nurse had left the state and wasn't here to speak for herself. She could have said she'd spent 11 years of her life before Vantage General doing things she'd never put on her nursing school application, in places that didn't appear on any map that was publicly accessible, and that the reason she knew what Brugada pattern changes looked like in the early stages was not because she'd read about them in a textbook. She said none of it. She reached up and unclipped her badge. She placed it on the counter, and then she picked up her coffee cup, the paper one, half cold, because she hadn't had time to finish it, and she walked toward the elevator without looking back. What the people watching in that corridor understood about Margaret Oakes was partial and incomplete, which is usually how understanding works. They knew she was good at her job in the way that some people are good at breathing, unconsciously, without visible effort, in a way that made other people wonder if they'd been doing it wrong. They knew she'd been at Vantage General since before the current building was built, which was long enough that she remembered the old facility on Carthage Road and could tell you which structural supports in the current building were poured 6 weeks behind schedule because of a concrete delivery dispute in 2009. They knew she lived somewhere south of town, that she drove a truck that was older than some of the residents, that she didn't attend the hospital social events and didn't apologize for not attending them, and that she'd been briefly married in her 40s to a man named Patrick, who was kind and decent and had waited for her to come home from something she'd never fully explained, and who still drove her to her annual cardiology appointment because her left knee was bad in cold weather and the hospital parking structure had uneven ramps. What they didn't know was almost everything else. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Keisha from nights turned to one of the day shift nurses and said quietly, "He just fired the best nurse in this building." The day shift nurse said, "What happens now?" Nobody had an answer for that. The parking garage at Vantage General was 5 levels, and Margaret's truck was on level 3 because she always used level 3 out of a habit, so old she couldn't remember forming it. She took the stairs rather than the elevator, not because she was avoiding anyone, but because she needed the time. The physical movement of descent, 1 flight at a time, concrete walls close enough to touch. Her knee ached on the second landing. She paused, shifted her weight, kept going. She was not a woman who cried easily. That wasn't numbness. It was a different thing, something more like training. The understanding that grief and shock and the desire to put your fist through something had their place and their time, and that place and time were not always immediate. She'd learned that in conditions that made a bad morning at a hospital in Delwood, Oregon, feel abstract. She'd learned it in the specific way you learn things that aren't taught in classrooms. Her truck smelled like the pine air freshener Patrick had put in it 3 months ago because he said she couldn't smell it anymore, and he was probably right. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at the concrete pillar in front of her for a while. She thought about Darius Webb, whether they'd keep him monitored, whether the day shift resident would catch the follow-up implications in the chart. She thought about the look on Fitch's face when she hadn't argued. She thought, that surprised him. She'd wanted to know if it would. It had. She started the truck. She didn't call Patrick right away because there wasn't a version of that call that went smoothly at 6:15 in the morning, and he'd had a cardiac procedure 6 months ago and still slept lightly and startled in ways he tried to hide. She'd tell him when she got home. She'd make coffee, and she'd sit at the kitchen table where the morning light came in a particular way between the curtains, and she'd tell him. She pulled out of level 3 and started down the exit ramp. Through the garage's open side on level 2, she could see the hospital entrance below, the ambulance bay, the covered walkway, the automatic glass doors catching the early light. She could see the corridor she'd just walked out of through the window panel of the main entrance, the nurse's station visible in the distance. She could also see, coming through those automatic doors, an orderly pushing a wheelchair with a man in it who was moving wrong. She stopped the truck on the exit ramp. The man in the wheelchair wasn't a typical transport patient. His body language was off. Not ill exactly, not in the ways she was used to reading, but something underneath illness. He was braced. He was holding something in his posture that looked like control over pain rather than absence of it, which was a different picture. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness in his upper body that comes from somewhere specific. The orderly was chatting at him, and the man was nodding without tracking any of it. Margaret watched him go through the doors. She let out a slow breath. She drove down to level 1 and pulled out of the garage into the early morning and told herself it wasn't her problem anymore. The coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital was called Pella's, and it had been there longer than the hospital's current building and possibly longer than Vantage General itself, though the ownership had changed twice. Margaret had been coming here since the first year of her tenure, which meant that the woman behind the counter, a heavyset woman named Brenda, who had inexplicably been here through both ownership changes, knew Margaret's order without asking and had the cup started when she saw Margaret's truck park outside. "You're early," Brenda said when Margaret came through the door. "I'm done," Margaret said. Brenda looked at her for a moment. "Done for the day?" "Done generally." Another pause. Brenda slid the cup across the counter. "Retirement?" Something like that. Brenda had known Margaret long enough not to press. That was a quality Margaret had always appreciated in her. The understanding that some information is offered and some isn't, and the difference between asking and waiting. Margaret took her coffee and sat at the small table near the front window where she could see the street. She'd been there perhaps 20 minutes when her phone lit up. The number was Keisha's. She let it ring twice before she picked up. "Keisha." "Ms. Oakes." Keisha's voice was tight in a way that cut through the ambient noise of the coffee shop immediately. "I need you to come back." "I can't come back. I know what happened. Everybody on the floor knows what happened." A pause, and in the background Margaret could hear the particular acoustic signature of a hospital floor moving fast, voices overlapping, the roll of equipment, the sharp beeps of monitors changing state. "That man they brought in. The visitor. He's downstairs in the atrium. They're saying he just—" "Ms. Oakes, the team down there isn't handling it." Margaret was already standing. "What's his presentation?" "Respiratory distress, they think. But his pressure's doing something weird, and the attending called for a crash cart. And then, I don't know, I'm getting this secondhand, but apparently he's not responding to standard protocol, and the resident is talking about defibrillation, and someone else is saying, 'Wait, who's the attending?'" "Greaves." Margaret closed her eyes for one full second. Dr. Evan Greaves was not a bad physician. He was a competent, methodical, careful physician who worked well within defined parameters and struggled significantly when the parameters didn't hold. She'd worked alongside him for 8 years. She respected him. She also knew exactly what happened when Evan Greaves encountered a presentation that didn't match his schema. A very specific paralysis that looked like deliberation and was something else. "I'm not authorized to be in that building," she said. "I know," Keisha said. There was a silence between them that contained everything neither of them was saying. "I know," Keisha said again, quieter. Margaret was already picking up her keys. But she came through the main entrance at a pace that was not quite running, because running would draw attention in the wrong way, and she needed 30 seconds of invisibility to get to the atrium. She had no badge. She had a paper coffee cup from Pella's, and she was still in her scrubs from the overnight, and she moved with the specific confidence of someone who knew where every junction in this building led, because she did. The atrium was off to the main lobby, a wide glass-roofed space that the hospital had built during a renovation in the mid-2000s, intended to feel less institutional. It featured a small cafe counter, several seating arrangements, and a mural on the east wall that the staff privately described as unfortunate. In the center of that space, a man was on the floor. The man from the wheelchair. She'd been right about the shoulders. There were 4 people around him. An orderly, Greaves, a resident she recognized from days whose name she kept forgetting, and a nursing assistant who looked like she was holding herself together by force of will. The crash cart was there, positioned but not in use. 2 nurses from the ER were coming through the connecting corridor at speed. Greaves was kneeling, 2 fingers on the man's wrist, his face doing the thing it did when he was recalculating. Margaret walked past the small gathering of bystanders who'd frozen near the cafe counter. She set her coffee cup on an empty table. She crouched on the man's other side. "What's the rhythm?" she said. Greaves looked up at her. Something complicated moved across his face. Surprise, then something she might have read as relief if she'd had time to read it. "Ms. Oakes, you're not—" "I know. What's the rhythm?" "PEA," said the resident. That was the name. She remembered it now. Tomas. He was 3 months into his 2nd year. Or close to it. Rate's there, but pressure's not, and the pattern's wrong. It keeps— Does he have any history on file? He's not a patient. He's a visitor. He was here to see someone on— Does he have ID, any medical alert? "There's a card," the nursing assistant said, and held it out. A small laminated card from a wallet, the kind some patients carried. Margaret took it without looking away from the man on the floor, because what she was looking at was more informative than any card. The way he was holding even in unconsciousness. The particular pallor. The scar on the side of his neck that was old and surgical, and not the kind of thing you got in a hospital setting, the kind of thing you got somewhere else. She looked at the card. Medical alert, it said. Incomplete spinal decompression, C4 to C6. Autonomic dysreflexia risk. Non-standard vagal response. Do not use standard defib protocols without specialist consult. "Don't defib him," she said. Greaves said, "Ms. Oakes, his rhythm. His rhythm looks like it needs shocking because his autonomic response is non-standard. Defib him and you'll push him into a full arrest. He needs positional intervention first and a specific drug sequence." She was already moving, adjusting the man's position with her hands under his shoulders, a specific angle. "Tomas, I need you to listen to me. Atropine is contraindicated for him. I need you to get me— You're not authorized to give orders in this. Evan." She looked up at Greaves. She rarely used his first name. "I know what this is. I've seen it. If you have someone who can give these orders right now and knows what they're looking at, put them here. If you don't, let me work." The atrium was very quiet except for the man's labored breathing and the distant sounds of the lobby. Greaves said, "What do you need?" She told him. He got it. Set. 12 minutes later, the man's pressure was coming back up, and his rhythm had normalized to something that still wasn't textbook, but was sustainable, which was the difference between a story that continued and one that didn't. The ER nurses had taken over the monitoring with Margaret talking them through the specifics, and Tomas was on the phone with a specialist at Cascade Regional who knew the patient's file and was confirming everything Margaret had said, step by step. With the flat intonation of someone who was not surprised by what he was hearing, Margaret stood up slowly. Her knee protested the crouch she'd been in for 12 minutes. She stepped back from the cluster of medical personnel and picked up her Pella's coffee from the table where she'd left it and took a long drink of it, cold now. From the lobby side of the atrium, she could see through the glass partition into the main corridor beyond. She could see the nurse's station on the far side of the check-in desk. She could see, standing near the administrative wing entrance with 2 other men, Roland Fitch. He was looking directly at her. She met his eyes. Then she looked away because she'd made her point simply by being here and by the man on the floor being alive. And that was enough. That was more than enough. And she'd learned a long time ago in places much less comfortable than this that making your point and grinding it in were different things, and only one of them served the actual mission. She was still thinking about that when she heard the doors. Not the automatic lobby doors, which had a particular hiss she knew. These were heavier, and there were too many of them, opening in sequence, and then the sound of boots on the lobby floor. Not one set, not 2, but several, moving in a formation that was very specific and didn't belong in a hospital lobby at 7:15 in the morning. Margaret turned toward the glass partition. In the lobby, through the glass, she could see the main entrance. She could see the morning light coming in hard and flat, off the glass front of the building. She could see the cluster of bystanders near the entrance doors stepping back and to the sides, the way people step when something is coming through that carries its own gravity. She could see the vehicles in the drop-off lane outside. She counted 3. Black. The kind of vehicles that didn't come with commercial plates. Through the partition, she watched 6 figures cross the lobby threshold in a formation she recognized in her body before her brain had finished processing what she was seeing. Not because she'd seen it recently, because she'd seen it a long time ago, in a different country, in conditions that had nothing to do with a hospital atrium in Delwood, Oregon. The man at the front of the formation was perhaps 50, broad through the jaw, with close-cropped silver hair and the posture of someone who had spent so many years in a certain physical discipline that the discipline had become structural. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark pants, but the way he held himself in those clothes made them irrelevant. He scanned the lobby once, with the economy of someone whose eyes know exactly what they're looking for. They found her through the glass partition. He said something to the man on his left. Then the formation moved toward the atrium door. Margaret set down her coffee cup. She did not move toward them, and she did not move away from them, which was the only response that made sense. The only response she had, because she had spent 31 years here building a life out of what she'd left behind, and she had never explained it to anyone, not to Patrick, not to Keisha, not to the 23 residents she'd trained who were now attendings in hospitals across the country. She had let the parts of herself that she'd carried here remain invisible by choice. And it had been the right choice, and she had not regretted it. She stood very still as the atrium door opened. The man with silver hair walked toward her across the terrazzo floor. Behind him, through the glass partition, she could see Roland Fitch watching. She could see Fitch's expression change as he watched the formation enter the atrium, as he began to understand that whatever was happening was not something he had the authority to involve himself in. And that understanding was visible on his face, in a way that would have satisfied her more if she'd had the capacity to pay attention to it. She didn't, because the man with silver hair had stopped in front of her, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not official, not procedural, something more complicated than either of those. He said, "Nurse Oakes." Not Ms., not ma'am. Nurse. "That depends," Margaret said carefully, "on who's asking." He reached into his jacket. He removed a folded document and held it out. She took it. She unfolded it. She read the letterhead once, then the body of the document, and her hands were very steady because she had trained them to be steady a long time ago in places that required it. When she looked up, the atrium was completely silent. Every person in it, Greaves, Tomas, the ER nurses, the bystanders from the cafe counter, and through the glass partition a growing cluster of hospital staff who had drifted from the corridor to see what was happening, was watching her. "You came a long way," she said. "We've been looking for a while," the man said. "It took some time to find you." She folded the document back along its original creases. She held it for a moment. Behind her, she heard Roland Fitch's voice from the lobby side of the partition, carrying through the partial gap of the atrium door. "What the hell is—" One of the figures in the formation turned slightly, and whatever Fitch saw in that turn made him stop speaking mid-sentence. Margaret looked down at the document in her hands. Then she looked at the man with silver hair. "Why now?" she said. He said, "Because the man whose life you saved 11 years ago asked us to find you." The words landed in the silence of the atrium the way stones land in still water, completely, with the weight of something that can't be taken back once it's in. "And because," he said, and his voice changed in a way she wouldn't have been able to describe precisely but recognized completely, "you just saved another one." The man's name was Commander Dale Rush, and he said it the way military men say their names, like rank first, like the title is load-bearing, like without it the name means less. He didn't extend his hand immediately. He watched her read the document a second time, and he waited. And that patience was its own kind of communication. Margaret folded the document again. She'd read enough official paperwork in her life to know when something was real and when it was constructed to look real. This was real. The letterhead, the authorization codes in the lower margin, the specific language in the body, language that didn't come from a template, language that came from people who knew exactly what they were referencing. "Who else has seen this?" she said. "On your end?" "Nobody." Rush glanced briefly at the partition. We'd prefer to keep the conversation somewhere less public, if that's an option. It wasn't entirely an option, and they both knew it. The atrium had perhaps 30 people in it now, counting the staff who'd migrated in from the corridor, and the glass partition to the lobby was doing very little to contain the attention of everyone on the other side. Margaret could see two nurses she'd worked with for years standing near the check-in desk, watching through the glass with the particular expression of people witnessing something they don't yet have a category for. She also could see Roland Fitch, who had moved closer to the partition door and was now speaking in a low voice to one of the hospital's administrative assistants. The assistant had a phone to her ear. "We can use the family consultation room," Margaret said, "down that corridor, second left. It's usually empty at this hour." "We'd need it to remain empty." "I'll get Keisha." She didn't wait for his confirmation. She moved to the edge of the atrium and caught Keisha's eye through the half-open partition door. Keisha, who had worked the night shift and technically should have been gone 45 minutes ago, who had called Margaret from this building and was therefore still here, still in it, the way Keisha tended to be in things once they started. A single look passed between them that covered the distance of 11 years of working the same floor. "Consultation 2, Margaret said. "Keep it clear." Keisha didn't ask questions. She moved. The family consultation room was a small rectangle with beige walls and furniture chosen for durability rather than comfort. 3 chairs, a small table, a box of tissues on the windowsill that nobody ever seemed to restock. The window faced the side parking lot. The fluorescent overhead was the kind that buzzed slightly at the frequency you stopped consciously hearing after a while, but that your body registered anyway. Rush came in with 2 of his people. The other 4 remained outside in the corridor, which told Margaret something about what Rush considered necessary versus precautionary, and the distinction was informative. He took the chair across from her. His people stood near the door and the window, not aggressively, just present. "Before I say anything," Margaret said, "I want to know how you found me." "You're not as hidden as you think," Rush said. "Your nursing license has your name on it. Employment records. It wasn't a covert operation." "That's not what I'm asking." He understood. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You did a good job of separating. Different state, different field than what anyone would look for. Name unchanged, but everything else different. The issue is that what you did 11 years ago is in a report. It's classified, but it's documented. And when the man you saved came to us 8 months ago and asked us to find you, we had a starting point. Why didn't he reach out himself?" "He tried. A few times." Rush paused. "You're not easy to reach." That was fair. Margaret's phone was unlisted. Her address was registered to a P.O. box in town. She was not on social media. She had not attended any of the professional nursing conferences where she might have been findable. She had done none of these things deliberately and all of them deliberately, which was its own kind of answer. "The man who collapsed in the atrium," she said. "He wasn't a coincidence." "No. He's connected to this." "His name is Marcus Teller. He's a retired Army Special Forces medic, TBI, and spinal injury from 2009, been dealing with autonomic complications since. He's the brother of a man you treated 11 years ago." Rush watched her face. "Captain Leon Teller. Do you remember him?" She remembered him. She'd spent 4 days at his side in a field hospital outside of a town she couldn't name here. He had been unconscious for 3 of those days, and she hadn't known if he would come back up from it. The 4th day, he'd opened his eyes, and the first thing he'd said was a very specific profanity that told her his cognitive function was intact, and she'd been so relieved she'd laughed, which she hadn't expected to do. She remembered his hands, which were large and had a distinctive scar across the right palm from something that had happened before she knew him. She remembered that he'd had a photograph in his shirt pocket, tucked against his chest, that survived everything. A woman and a girl, probably 10 or 11 in the photo. "I remember him," she said. "He's been trying to find you since he got stateside. He wrote letters. He didn't have an address, so he sent them to every nursing registry in the Pacific Northwest and asked them to forward if possible." Rush reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Not a folder of official documents, but an actual envelope, off-white, slightly worn on one corner. A few of them made it to Vantage General. They sat in administrative mail for almost a year. Margaret looked at the envelope. She didn't take it yet. "The administrator," she said. "Fitch. We don't know if he saw them. We know they didn't reach you." She picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She held it in her lap and looked at it for a moment, and there was something moving in her chest that she wasn't going to let move through her face. Not here, not in front of a room of people. She'd learned that too. Some things you felt in private because they were yours and they didn't need an audience. You said Marcus Teller was Leon's brother, she said. Is. Leon's stationed at Fort Harlan now, about 4 hours from here. He's been there 6 months. Rush paused. He asked to come today. We told him it might not, that we didn't know what we'd find. He said he'd be there regardless. Another pause. He's outside. The consultation room was very quiet. He's been outside this building, Rush said, since 6 this morning. Boy, what happened next happened fast, which was not how Margaret had expected it to go. She asked for 5 minutes, which Rush gave her without discussion. She used 3 of them in the small bathroom adjacent to the consultation room, where she ran cold water over her wrists the way she'd done in triage situations when she needed to bring her focus down to a single operational point. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was practical. Cold water on the pulse point, 30 seconds, and you remembered what was in front of you and what wasn't. She used the other 2 minutes reading the first page of the letter in the envelope. She didn't read past the first page. She folded it back and put it in the pocket of her scrubs and went back into the consultation room. Where's Marcus Teller now? She asked. Stabilized? ER Bay 3, they said. Has anyone told Leon? One of my people is with him outside. He knows his brother is. He should be in there with him. She picked up her coffee cup from the table where she'd set it when she came in, found it empty, set it back down. That's where he should be, not waiting outside for me. Rush almost said something. She could see it move through him. Whatever calculation he was making about what his role was here and where the lines were. He settled on, I'll have him brought in. Thank you. She looked at the 2 men near the door and the window. I need a minute before I talk to anyone else. They looked at Rush. He nodded once, and they moved into the corridor. Rush stood. He was taller standing than sitting, which she'd noticed before and registered differently now in the small room. He was also, she realized, carrying something in his posture that wasn't purely official, a tension around the jaw, a slight forward weight in his stance. She'd been reading people's bodies for a long time, in conditions where reading them correctly was a functional necessity, and what she read in him now was something more personal than a mission. Commander, she said. He stopped at the door. What's your stake in this? The question hung in the fluorescent buzz of the room. He turned slightly, not fully facing her, which was its own answer. Leon Teller saved my life in 2004, he said, before whatever happened in 2013 that you were part of. He paused. I'd call it a debt, but he'd call it something else. Either way, I was going to be the one to find you. She nodded. That was clean. She respected clean. He left, and she stood alone in the consultation room for 45 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. And then she went out into the corridor where everything was already moving faster than she'd expected. The hospital had the quality of a place that has registered something has changed without knowing what, specifically. Margaret felt it when she stepped out of the consultation room. A different texture in the air, the way a building feels when its routines have been disrupted, not by one thing, but by several things at once. Staff moved with the slightly heightened alertness of people who were aware of something happening on a floor below or a wing over. She counted 2 different clusters of employees in the corridor who appeared to be discussing something in low voices and stopped when she came through. She went to the ER bay. Bay 3 had the curtain half drawn, and through the gap she could see Marcus Teller with his eyes open, his color better than it had been in the atrium, an oxygen cannula in place, and a monitor registering a rhythm she liked significantly more than the one she'd seen on the floor. A nurse she knew. Priya, who'd been on ER rotation for about 6 years, was adjusting the flow rate on the IV. Standing at the foot of the gurney, still in the jacket he'd apparently been wearing since 6 in the morning while he waited outside this building, was a man who looked like the photograph she'd kept in her memory for 11 years, and also didn't look like it, because he was older now and the photograph had been taken before whatever had happened to his right shoulder, which had clearly been broken and rebuilt. Leon Teller. He was looking at his brother when Margaret came through the curtain gap, and then he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. His face did something complicated. She'd expected it to, and she'd prepared for it, And it still caught her off guard because you can prepare for something and still be surprised by the specific shape it takes. He looked like a man who had been holding something for a long time and had just been told it was okay to put it down. "Ms. Oakes," he said. His voice was steady, which she suspected cost him something. "It's Margaret," she said. She'd never gone by the formal version. "How long have you been standing out there?" "Since 600. That's a long time in a parking lot. I've waited in worse places." She looked at Marcus, who was watching them both with the detached assessment of someone in mild pain trying to determine what he's walked into. "He's going to be okay," she said. "His cardiologist will want to see him in the next day or two, and there may be a medication adjustment needed, but what happened this morning is manageable." "The nurse out front said you saved him." "I recognized his presentation. That's different." "How is it different?" She glanced at him. "Saving someone is what the ER team did. I pointed them in the right direction. It matters, but it's not the same thing." Leon was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been trying to find the right words for 11 years. "You don't need words. I wrote you letters." "I know." She put her hand briefly on the bed rail. Not his, not Marcus's, just the bed rail, grounding. "I read the first page of one of them this morning. I'll read the rest when I'm sitting down somewhere quiet." "How many did you get?" She looked at him. "Rush said several were delivered to the hospital." She kept her voice neutral. "I didn't receive them." Something shifted in Leon's expression. He heard what she wasn't saying. He was sharp. He'd always been sharp, even half-conscious in a field hospital with a head injury. He'd tracked what was happening around him with a precision that had made her job easier and harder simultaneously. "They were delivered to this hospital, to the administrative office, and they didn't reach you." "No." The beep of the monitor marked the silence between them. Marcus cleared his throat. "I'm going to go ahead and pretend I'm asleep," he said, and closed his eyes with a deliberateness that made Priya hide a smile and look away. What Margaret didn't do was go back to the administrative wing, not immediately. She knew Fitch was there, and she knew Rush's people were making contact with the hospital administration through whatever official channels required official documents to open, and she knew that process was going to produce something. She could feel it gathering in the building around her. The particular atmospheric pressure of an institutional situation that is about to crack open along a fault line it has been pretending wasn't there. She'd worked in enough hospitals to know what that felt like. She'd worked in enough other environments to know it even more clearly. What she did instead was go back to the third floor. Not because she had any authority to be there. She'd turned in her badge. Technically, she was a civilian visitor who happened to be wearing scrubs. But the third floor was the floor she knew, and there was a patient on that floor whose chart she wanted to check before she walked out of this building. Darius Webb was in room 318, which was a double room with the second bed currently empty. He was awake, which was better than the alternative. He was 29, as his intake form had said, and he looked 29 in the way that people who've been through something look their exact age rather than younger or older. No margin on it, just precisely the years they'd spent. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "You're the nurse from last night," he said. "I was," she said. "I'm not anymore, technically." He considered that. "What happened?" "It's complicated." She moved to his bedside, not presuming to touch the chart. She'd lost her access along with her badge. But looking at what was visible on the monitor, at the color in his face, at the way he was holding himself. "How are you feeling?" "Like I died and didn't." "You almost did." "Not last night. Last night was the close call. The thing underneath it has been building for a while. They told me." He was quiet for a moment. "The doctor this morning said there was something in my heart that the shape of it was wrong. Said they almost missed it. They would have caught it eventually." "Eventually," he said. The word had a weight he was working through. She pulled the chair next to his bed and sat, which she didn't do often. Sitting in a patient's room had a particular kind of time commitment she usually didn't have. "You were in the service." "Yeah." "What branch?" "Marines, 2 deployments." He looked at the ceiling. "The second one is why They said the heart thing might be connected to a blast injury I had. Said the pressure wave can do things that don't show up on scans for years." She knew that. She'd seen it more than she could count. "Who's your cardiologist going to be?" "Some guy named Pallister." He's good, she said, and meant it. He'll catch what needs catching. She stood because she was out of authorization to be here, and staying longer than this was pushing the goodwill of the situation. Is there someone I can call for you? Family? My mom's coming. She's driving from Salem. He paused. She's going to lose her mind when she gets here. That's what moms do? Yeah. He looked at her directly, and there was something in his look that was more than the look you gave someone who'd adjusted your heart rhythm in a bad hour. Thank you, he said, for staying last night. I heard what happened. I heard what happened to you. She looked at him for a moment. She didn't say it's fine because it wasn't. And she didn't say it'll work out because she didn't know yet if that was true. And she didn't say you don't owe me anything because he hadn't offered to owe her anything. He'd simply said thank you. Get some sleep, she said. Your mom's going to want you coherent when she arrives. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. She walked out of room 318 and back toward the stairwell, and she was nearly to the door when she heard her name. She turned. It was Dr. Lena Marsh from the third floor's attending rotation, a woman who was perhaps 6 years younger than Margaret and had the specific energy of someone who chose their battles carefully because they were in a target-rich environment. They had worked together for 9 years. They were not friends in the social sense, but they were something, the kind of professional relationship built from mutual respect and shared hours, and the specific intimacy of watching each other work under pressure. What's happening downstairs? Marsh said. It wasn't gossip the way she asked it. It was a direct question. I'm not entirely sure yet, Margaret said honestly. Are you coming back? Margaret looked at her. The stairwell door was 5 feet behind her. I don't know. Marsh crossed her arms, not defensively, thoughtfully. I told Fitch this morning that what he did was wrong, she said, after you left. I want you to know that. What did he say? He said my input was noted. A pause. Which means nothing. It means something, Margaret said. Did Shayad? It just doesn't mean anything he's going to act on. She went down the stairs. The administrative wing of Vantage General occupied the northeast corner of the ground floor. A cluster of offices and conference rooms separated from the clinical space by a set of frosted glass doors that were usually propped open and today were notably closed. Margaret could see motion through the frosted glass as she crossed the lobby. More than the usual motion, people moving with purpose rather than routine. She stopped short of the glass doors. Keisha was standing near the lobby elevator bay, watching the same thing. When she spotted Margaret, she crossed to her. 2 of those military guys went in there about 20 minutes ago, Keisha said, low, with documents. Whatever they showed the hospital director, that's Director Knoll, not Fitch, the actual director. She went gray. Who's in there now? Knoll, Fitch, 2 of those men, and someone from legal who got called in. They've been in there since. Keisha paused. Fitch's assistant came out about 10 minutes ago to get water, and she looked like she'd seen something come out of the wall. What about Rush? The main one? He's in the consultation room still, I think, with the other man. Leon. Margaret nodded. Okay. Okay, meaning what? Meaning I'm going to wait. Keisha looked at her with the expression she wore when Margaret said something that required translation. You're going to wait, she repeated. They walked you out of this building 2 hours ago. There are military personnel with official documents in the director's office. A man you apparently saved 11 years ago in a classified situation is in the consultation room, and you're going to wait. I don't have any authority to be in that room, Margaret said. Those men do. They're doing something that needs to happen in a specific order, and I'm not the one who does it. You were the one who saved Darius Webb last night. And Marcus Teller this morning, according to you. According to Priya, according to Tomas, according to everyone who watched it happen. Margaret looked at her steadily. I know what I did. I don't need to be in that room to know what I did. Keisha was quiet for a moment, working through something. Does it bother you that he just fired you and now all of this is happening and you're standing out here while he's in there? The question was clean and direct, the way Keisha's questions usually were. Margaret appreciated that. She thought about it honestly. Yes, she said. Parts of it. What parts? The letters, she said. That part bothers me. Keisha didn't ask her to elaborate. She knew Margaret well enough to hear what was in it. If letters addressed to Margaret had arrived at this hospital and not reached her, they'd gone somewhere. They'd been seen by someone. That was a specific thing, not an ambiguous procedural gap. That was a choice. The frosted glass doors opened. Roland Fitch came through them, and he was not in his administrative clothes anymore. He was in his administrative clothes with something added to them, a quality of undoing, like a man who went into a room constructed one way and was coming out of it different without having had time to process the change. His face was doing something controlled and not quite succeeding. He stopped when he saw Margaret. The lobby was not crowded, but it was not empty. There were people at the check-in desk, a family near the elevator bay, 2 nurses crossing the lobby from the ER corridor. Several of them looked up. Fitch's jaw was tight. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the entire weight of the morning was in that 10 feet of lobby floor between them. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. And then, behind him, the frosted glass doors opened again, and hospital director Karen Knoll came through, and with her were 2 of Rush's people, and a woman in a civilian suit who had federal written in the way she carried herself. Knoll was holding a folder. She was walking toward Margaret. Fitch saw it happening. He watched Knoll cross the lobby toward Margaret, and he understood in real time what the motion meant, and his face did the thing that faces do when something a person thought was settled turns out not to be settled at all. "Ms. Oakes," Knoll said. She was a deliberate woman, not warm, but not cold, efficient, which Margaret had always found she could work with. "Would you come with me, please?" "To where?" Margaret said. "My office." A pause. "There are some things that need to be said, and I'd like to say them with everyone present." Margaret looked briefly back at Keisha, who was already watching with the expression of someone who is going to want a full accounting of this later. She looked at the frosted glass doors where more people had appeared, hospital staff drifting toward the lobby from various directions, drawn by the specific current that moves through a building when something important is being decided. She looked at Fitch, who was standing very still. She followed Director Knoll through the frosted glass doors. The director's office was larger than the consultation room and furnished with the institutional ambition of a budget renovation. A conference table that seated 8, framed photographs of the hospital's history on the wall, a whiteboard with the remnants of a scheduling diagram that no one had erased. Rush was already there, standing to the right of the head of the table. Leon Teller was there, which surprised her. He nodded when she came in, a small specific nod, the kind that carries more than it shows. The federal woman in the suit introduced herself as Agent Calloway from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, which was a designation that had specific gravity and landed accordingly. She had a physical file in front of her that was thick in the way that files are when they've been building for a while. Director Knoll sat at the head of the table. She folded her hands. "Miss Oakes," she said, "I owe you an apology that is well past due, and I'm going to start there." Margaret sat in the chair across from Rush. "Okay," she said. "Roland Fitch joined this administration 3 years ago." Knoll's voice was steady in the careful way of someone who has been reviewing something for the last 40 minutes and has made decisions about what to say and how to say it. At the time of his appointment, there were concerns flagged by 2 former employees regarding his methodology and previous roles at other facilities. Those concerns were not given adequate weight. That's a failure of process, and it's one I own. "What kind of concerns?" Margaret said. Calloway answered, which was itself a signal. "Mr. Fitch has a documented pattern at 3 previous institutions of identifying senior staff, particularly senior nursing staff, who represent a visibility risk to administrative irregularities and engineering departures." She opened the file. At St. Croix Methodist in Nevada, 2 charge nurses were terminated in 2018 for protocol violations that were later determined to be manufactured. At Brennan Regional in Idaho, a nursing director's retirement was accelerated following a documentation dispute that subsequent review could not substantiate. The pattern is, it's consistent. Margaret absorbed that. 11 years of Fitch, somewhere she'd never worked, doing the same thing, which meant she hadn't been singular, which meant she'd been a type, the kind of person he knew how to identify and move against. That was an unpleasant shape to have in her head. "And the letters?" she said. A brief silence in the room. "The letters addressed to me at this hospital," she said, "from Captain Teller." Noel looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at the file. We have reason to believe Mr. Fitch intercepted administrative mail on at least 2 occasions. We're still establishing the full extent. That's a crime, Margaret said flatly. It is, Calloway said. Rush, who had been standing quietly through this, shifted his weight slightly. He wasn't surprised. He'd known before walking through Vantage General's doors what he was walking into, or at least the shape of it, which was why he'd brought Calloway. Leon said, "Can I?" and then stopped himself. He looked at Noel. "I'm sorry, this isn't my meeting." "Say it," Margaret told him. He looked at her. "He kept you from finding out someone was looking for you. That's not just administrative misconduct." "No," she agreed, "it's not." The room was quiet for a moment with the particular weight of things being named. Director Noel opened the folder in front of her and removed a document. She slid it across the table to Margaret. It was on hospital letterhead, and it had today's date at the top, and it was a formal reinstatement letter with a salary adjustment that reflected, the accompanying note said, corrective recognition of Ms. Oakes's experience and service record. Margaret looked at it. She didn't pick it up immediately. "We would also like," Noel said, and her voice changed slightly here in a way that sounded like someone stepping over something they didn't want to step over but understood was necessary, "to discuss Mr. Fitch's departure from the hospital and the steps we'll be taking going forward with regard to the irregularities that Agent Calloway has identified." "Departure," Margaret said, "effective this morning." She looked at the reinstatement letter. She looked at Leon, who was watching her with the contained intensity of a man trying to give her space to think. She looked at Rush, who had his arms crossed and was watching the middle distance with the expression of someone who has gotten what he came for and is giving the moment its due. She picked up the reinstatement letter. She read it once, fully, every line. Then she set it down and said, "There's a patient in room 318 named Darius Webb. He was admitted last night with a cardiac arrhythmia related to a blast injury from his second deployment. He needs continuity of care through his cardiology referral, and I'd like to make sure his chart reflects the full clinical picture from last night's intervention." A pause. "Before I deal with anything else." Noel looked at her. Something moved in the director's face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of something. "Of course. And someone needs to check on Priya in ER Bay 3 because she's been on since 7 and Marcus Teller's monitoring is going to need a specific adjustment in about 2 hours that I should have documented before I walked out of there." "I'll make sure it's handled," Noel said. Margaret nodded. She looked at Calloway. "How long before Fitch's situation becomes public record?" "That depends on how the investigation develops," Calloway said. "The hospital's internal action is immediate. The broader investigation has its own timeline. I want to know when it does. You'll be kept informed." She looked at the reinstatement letter one more time. She thought about 31 years on the 3rd floor. She thought about Keisha in the lobby. She thought about Darius Webb's face when he said I almost died and didn't. She thought about a field hospital she couldn't name, and 4 days, and a photograph in a shirt pocket that survived everything. She thought about Patrick, who was still at home and didn't know any of this, who would find out when she called him, or when she walked through the door, whichever came first, and who would listen to the whole thing in the particular way he had of listening, not filling the silences, not managing her reaction, just listening, because he'd learned a long time ago that she needed the telling more than the responding. She was going to call him in about 4 minutes, but first she picked up the reinstatement letter and folded it once neatly and put it in the pocket of her scrubs next to Leon Teller's letter. And then the door opened. Not knocked. Opened. Opened with the specific urgency of someone who has been told not to interrupt and is interrupting anyway because what they're carrying is not interruptible. It was one of Rush's people, the one from the atrium door, the one who'd made Fitch stop speaking mid-sentence. His face was a professional mask, and something was moving behind it. He spoke directly to Rush, quietly, but the room was small. Margaret heard every word. "Sir," he said, "we have a problem. The security footage Calloway requested. The recordings from the 3rd floor nursing station, the last 18 months. The hospital's system shows they were flagged for manual review and deletion about 45 minutes ago." Everyone in the room went still. Rush turned slowly toward Director Noel, and his voice, when he spoke, was completely controlled. "Who has access to your security system's administrative functions?" Noel's face had gone the color of the whiteboard behind her. "It's restricted. Senior administration only. She stopped. Something was happening in her expression that looked like arithmetic she didn't want to complete. Fitch would have... Where is Roland Fitch right now? Calloway said, already reaching for her phone. And that was when Margaret understood that the 45 minutes since Fitch had walked through those frosted glass doors had not been him absorbing what was happening. It had been him doing something about it. He went out the main entrance, Margaret said, because she was the one who'd been standing in the lobby when he came through. 20 minutes ago, maybe 25. Calloway was on her phone before Margaret finished the sentence. Rush looked at his man in the door, and a fast and silent communication passed between them, the kind that doesn't need words because it's been practiced enough times that words are redundant. The man disappeared back through the door. In the silence that followed, Leon Teller exhaled slowly and said very quietly, "Of course." Margaret looked at the folded letters in her pocket. 31 years. And a man who had spent all of them underestimating what she was capable of had just made, in the last 20 minutes of his relevance to her life, the one move that was going to ensure he didn't walk away from any of this cleanly. She should have felt something neat about that. She didn't. She felt tired and alert in equal measure. The specific combination of a body that had been awake since before midnight and a mind that was still fully engaged, and underneath it something that wasn't satisfaction exactly, but was adjacent to it. The sense of a thing that has been held in the wrong position for too long finally being allowed to fall into its actual shape. "What do we do now?" Noel said. Calloway was still on her phone. She held up one finger. Margaret stood. She straightened her scrubs, a habit purely physical, the way she always moved before going somewhere that required her to be present in a specific way. "Now," she said, "I'm going to check on my patients." The third floor had the particular smell of a floor that has been running short-staffed. Not unclean, but compressed. The smell of too much work happening in a contained space with not enough air exchange. Margaret noticed it the way she always noticed it, involuntarily. The way a mechanic notices an engine sound that's 2 degrees off. She filed it and kept moving. Priya had already handled the Marcus Teller monitoring adjustment, which meant someone had communicated faster than Margaret expected, or Priya had caught it herself, which was also possible because Priya was the kind of nurse who caught things. Margaret made a note to say something to her about that later, then remembered she wasn't technically on shift, and the note would have to wait until she had a badge that let her say things in an official capacity again. The reinstatement letter was still in her pocket. She hadn't signed it. She'd read it twice more in the director's office, and both times it had sat in her hands like something she needed to weigh before accepting, not because it wasn't what she wanted, but because she was constitutionally unable to take anything at face value until she understood the full shape of it. 31 years in this building had not cured her of that, and 11 years before it had actively trained her against it. Darius Webb was asleep when she looked in on him. His mother had arrived, a woman perhaps 60 in a coat she'd clearly grabbed in a hurry, sitting in the chair beside his bed with her hand over his and her eyes closed in a way that wasn't sleep. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment and didn't go in. There was nothing she needed to do in that room right now. Everything that needed doing had been done. She went to the nurse's station instead. The day shift charge nurse was a woman named Lorraine who had been in the role for about 8 months and was competent in the way of someone still establishing themselves. Accurate, careful, slightly over-documenting because she hadn't yet developed the confidence to know what could stay in her head. She looked up when Margaret appeared, and her expression carried the specific weight of someone who'd heard everything and wasn't sure what protocol applied. "Webb's follow-up cardiology consult," Margaret said. "It needs to be flagged as priority, not routine. His presentation last night had features that suggest the structural issue is more advanced than the initial read." Yes, I'll flag it." Lorraine hesitated. Are you coming back?" "I haven't decided yet," Margaret said, which was true. But the flag on Webb's chart shouldn't wait for that decision. "Right, yes." Lorraine turned to the computer, then turned back. "Miss Oakes, what Fitch did this morning—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I didn't say anything when it happened. I should have said something." Margaret looked at her. Lorraine was perhaps 34 with the eyes of someone who understood she'd failed a test she hadn't known she was taking. That was worth something. The knowing, even after the fact. "Next time," Margaret said. Lorraine nodded, twice, as if she needed the repetition. Margaret walked back toward the stairwell. She was halfway there when her phone rang. It was Rush. "We found him," he said without preamble. "Where?" "Hospital parking garage, level 2. He didn't leave. He went to his car." A pause that had something in it, not hesitation, recalibration. "He wasn't trying to run. He had a laptop. He was in the middle of something when my people located him." "What was he doing?" "Finishing what he started, forwarding files." Another pause. "We don't know yet to who or where. Calloway's people have the laptop." Margaret stopped walking. She was standing near the stairwell door, the push bar cold under her hand where she'd already reached for it. "What kind of files?" "Clinical documentation. Looks like personnel records, incident reports, some patient files." His voice was controlled in the way of someone who is managing their own reaction. "Going back several years. The deletion of the security footage was a distraction, something to get people focused on the wrong thing while he completed the transfer." She stood very still. "Why?" she said. The question was specific. Not why would he do this. She understood why. She understood that a man who built his career on manufactured departures and buried documentation would have a system for when the system started collapsing. She meant why those files specifically. "What's in the personnel records that's worth the risk of getting caught in a parking garage?" "That," Rush said, "is what Calloway wants to know." She pushed through the stairwell door. Cheats. Level 2 of the parking garage had fluorescent lighting that was not quite adequate for a space that size, which created pockets of shadow between the vehicles that were particular and unpleasant at 8:40 in the morning when the angle of natural light coming through the open sides was hitting wrong. Margaret came through the stairwell door and found the situation immediately. Two of Rush's people standing next to a gray sedan in the middle of the row. Calloway crouched next to the open driver's side door. A third figure she didn't recognize standing back with a tablet. Fitch was in the driver's seat. He was not restrained, which told her the situation had been determined to be contained, but he had the specific posture of a man who understands that movement would be unwise. His laptop was on Calloway's tablet now. Transferred, she assumed. His phone was visible on the roof of the car where one of Rush's people had placed it. He looked up when Margaret came into his sightline. She'd thought about this moment a few times in the last 2 hours. The way you think about something when you know it's coming and you can feel it gathering. She'd thought about what she would feel and what she would say. She'd concluded, honestly, that she didn't know. What she felt when she actually saw him was tiredness. A very specific, very old tiredness that had nothing dramatic in it. "Ms. Oakes," he said. His voice was remarkably even. She gave him that. "Mr. Fitch, I assume you've been reinstated." "I assume the same." He looked through the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of his car. "I want you to know that what happened this morning was... I had legitimate grounds. The overtime policy is documented. The pattern of..." "I know," she said. He stopped. "I know what your grounds were," she said. "I know what the policy says. I also know that the pattern you identified was real and that you used it for something the policy wasn't designed for." She paused. "We both know the overtime wasn't the point." Something moved across his face. Not remorse, not exactly, but a kind of recognition. The acknowledgement of a person who knows they've been seen accurately and doesn't have a counterargument that's structurally sound. "The letters," he said. "Yes." A long pause. The garage was very quiet except for the ambient hum of the ventilation system, and far below on the street, the distant progression of morning traffic. "I need you to understand," he said, and stopped. He seemed to reconsider the beginning. "There are people in this hospital who..." He stopped again. "Who what?" Calloway said, from her crouch beside the door. He looked at Calloway. He looked at the men standing at the edge of the space. He looked at Margaret, and in his look was the specific expression of a man who has made a series of calculations over a long period and is arriving in a parking garage on a Tuesday morning at the conclusion that the calculations were wrong. He said nothing. Calloway straightened. She was a compact woman with efficient movements, the kind that suggested she'd spent time in environments where efficiency was physical necessity. "Mr. Fitch, The files you were transferring include patient records. That's not an administrative irregularity. That's a federal violation. She said it without drama, the way you say things that are simply true. I'd encourage you to think carefully about your next decision. Fitch's jaw worked. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel. I want a lawyer. That's your right, Calloway said, and we'll get you one. She stepped back from the door slightly. We're going to need you to come with us. He got out of the car slowly, with the deliberate movements of a man being careful not to give anyone a reason. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Margaret one more time, and whatever he was looking for in her face, he didn't find it. She didn't give him anything, not anger, not satisfaction. She watched him the way she watched a situation resolve, which is the way you watch it when you've been waiting for it long enough that the arrival is less event than confirmation. Rush's people moved him toward the stairwell. When the footsteps faded, Margaret was left in the parking garage with Calloway and the man with the tablet, and the particular silence of a space that has just been vacated by something significant. The files he transferred, Margaret said. Do you know who the recipient was? Not yet, Calloway said. We know the destination IP. We know it wasn't his personal email. She picked up his phone from the car roof with a gloved hand. The full picture is going to take some time. How much time? Days, not weeks. She looked at Margaret with the direct information processing look of a professional who has decided Margaret is someone worth being direct with. What I can tell you is that his behavior in the last hour suggests this isn't isolated to Vantage General. Margaret felt that land in a particular part of her chest. Other hospitals. Possibly. Possibly other things. A pause. The nature of what he was sending, if I'm reading it right, he had a relationship with someone outside this institution who found value in specific kinds of personnel documentation. What kind of value? Calloway looked at her for a long moment. The kind where someone's medical history, employment record, and incident documentation can be used as leverage. She said it carefully, each word placed deliberately. We'll know more once we've processed the transfer. Margaret processed that. A man who collected departures, charged nurses, directors, experienced people, and documented them. Documented the clinical details, the incident histories, the things that experienced medical professionals accumulated over long careers and might not want surfaced in particular ways. It was a different picture than she'd been working with, bigger and with an uglier architecture. She thought about the letters. 4 of them, Rush had said, forwarded to Vantage General's administrative address. She thought about what was in Leon Teller's letter and what anyone who read it before she did would understand about her previous career. Agent Calloway, she said. Yes? Is my previous service record part of what he was forwarding? Calloway met her eyes. Yes. The ventilation system hummed. Outside, the morning was fully established now. Sunlight on the concrete edge of the garage's open level, the sound of the city moving through its day. Margaret stood in the gap between a gray sedan and a concrete pillar and breathed through the specific sensation of understanding that you have been more exposed than you thought, and for longer. Okay, she said. We're going to need a full account from you, Calloway said. Not about the classified elements. Those stay in their channel, but about what you know of Fitch's conduct since he arrived at this hospital. Who he targeted, how, what the pattern looked like from inside it. When? This afternoon, if possible. We can use the hospital's conference space, or I can arrange Here's fine, Margaret said. This afternoon. She walked to the stairwell door. She pushed it open. She stopped. The other people he removed, she said. From this hospital, from the previous ones. Do you have a full list? We're building it. Build it fast, she said. Some of them left the field. Some of them may have left because of what he had on them, or what they thought he might do with it. She looked back over her shoulder. They deserve to know it's over. She went down the stairs. Leon Teller was in the lobby. He was standing near the main entrance with a coffee from the hospital cafe that he was holding rather than drinking, the way people hold warm things when they need something to do with their hands. He was watching the elevator bank with the patient stillness of a soldier who has learned that waiting is a skill and not a deficit, and he turned when she came through the lobby doors from the stairwell side. How's Marcus? She said. Better. He's asking to be discharged, which the ER doc said might be possible this afternoon if his numbers hold. Leon almost smiled. He's always been like that. Hates hospitals. Occupational hazard for someone with his history. Yeah. He looked at his coffee. What happened in the garage? Fitch is in custody. Calloway's team has his laptop. Is it bad? It's complicated. She looked at the lobby entrance, the morning light on the glass. It may be more than we understood this morning. Leon was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who could hold new information without immediately trying to resolve it. He sat with it, which was a different thing from ignoring it, and Margaret had always found that useful in a person. What do you need right now? He said. The question surprised her, which it probably shouldn't have. People didn't usually ask her that. They asked her what was happening, what she knew, what came next. They asked for her assessment of the situation and her clinical judgment and her institutional memory. They rarely asked what she needed. I need to call my husband, she said. Something in his face relaxed slightly, the way faces relax when they get a human answer instead of a tactical one. Go ahead, he said. I'll be here. She went to the small alcove near the gift shop where the phone signal was better than the lobby. She'd learned that years ago, one of the 1,000 small operational details of a building she'd lived in for 3 decades, and she called Patrick. He picked up on the second ring. Maggie! His voice had the morning texture of someone who'd woken up not quite an hour ago. I was starting to wonder. I know. I'm sorry. She leaned against the wall of the alcove. The gift shop was opening. She could hear the key in the lock, the rattle of the gate. Something happened this morning. Are you okay? I'm fine. It's complicated. I'm going to be here for a while longer. A pause. She could hear him moving, the specific sound of him sitting up, adjusting. What happened? She told him. Not everything, not the full architecture of it, but the essential shape. Fitch, the badge, the atrium, Rush, Leon Teller. She told him about the letters. She could hear what that did to him in the quality of the silence, the way his breathing changed. He kept the letters, Patrick said. Yes. How many? 4 that we know of. Another silence. Patrick did not swear often, but she heard what was moving behind the restraint of his particular quiet. He'd known something happened to her before Vantage General. He knew the shape of it without the content, the way spouses know things when they are paying attention and not demanding translation. He'd known about the time she'd spent in places she couldn't name, and he'd never pressed. And she'd always understood that the not pressing was an act of love of a specific and substantial kind. These military people, he said carefully, are you safe? I'm safe. This is a good thing, Patrick. It's a strange morning, but it's a good thing. Okay. She heard him exhale. Okay. Do you need me to come? Not yet. Maybe later. She closed her eyes briefly. The gift shop gate had finished opening, and she could smell the artificial flowers and cellophane from 20 feet away. I'm going to sign the reinstatement letter. Good. I wasn't sure. I know you weren't. His voice was even and warm in the way it had been for 22 years, the way that had nothing performative in it. Are you sure now? She thought about Darius Webb's face in room 318. She thought about Lorraine at the nurse's station, and the specific look of someone who had failed a test they'd understand better next time. She thought about 23 residents who were now attendings, and the specific things she'd passed to each of them that didn't come from a textbook, and the people they'd saved who would never know the chain of it. Yes, she said. Then sign it, he said. I'll have dinner ready when you get home. She had hung up and stood in the alcove for 10 seconds, which was all she allowed. Then she went back out to the lobby. She signed the letter in Director Knoll's office at 9:40 with a pen that had the hospital logo on it, which she found briefly absurdly funny, though she didn't say so. Knoll watched her sign with the expression of someone completing a task they should have avoided needing to complete. Rush was there. Leon was not. He'd gone back to the ER to sit with Marcus, which was the right place for him. What happened in the next 2 hours had the quality of aftermath, which is its own kind of work, less dramatic than crisis, more grinding, the specific labor of things being documented and processed and formally established after the acute phase. Calloway's team set up in a conference room. Hospital legal came and went. Two members of the nursing staff who had witnessed the morning's events gave voluntary statements. Noel began making phone calls that Margaret could hear through closed doors as she passed. Controlled, measured phone calls that had the cadence of someone managing institutional narrative, which was its own kind of necessary thing, even if it wasn't the most important kind. Margaret spent an hour with Calloway. She told her everything about Fitch that she could document or specifically recall: dates, incidents, patterns. She told her about the previous charge nurse who'd left the state, a woman named Renata Griggs, who'd been on the cardiac floor for 16 years before Fitch's arrival and was gone within 8 months of it. She told her about two staff physicians who'd been pushed toward early retirement through a methodology she'd observed but not been able to formally challenge at the time. She told her about the overtime policy and the specific way it was enforced selectively, which she could demonstrate through scheduling records if Calloway's team could pull them. Calloway wrote in a notebook, longhand, which Margaret found unexpectedly reassuring. It meant she was tracking structure, not just data. "The patient files he was sending," Calloway said at one point. "We've identified the destination. It's a private data broker. Operates in a gray zone, technically legal in the jurisdiction they're registered in, practically used for leverage and selective disclosure." She looked at Margaret. "Some of the files go back 8 years. Before Fitch arrived." "Correct. Which means he either brought existing material with him or someone at Vantage General was doing this before he arrived, and he continued it." Margaret held that thought. 8 years. Before Fitch, the clinical operations director had been a man named Gerald Hartwick, who'd retired with considerable institutional appreciation and a reception in the main atrium with a cake. She'd attended the reception. She'd eaten a piece of the cake. She'd had no particular feeling about Hartwick one way or another, which was, she realized now, possibly information. "I'll give you Hartwick's name," she said. "I don't have evidence of anything, but you should look." "We will," Calloway said. At 11:15, Calloway took a phone call and stepped out of the conference room. She was gone for 8 minutes. When she came back, she had the expression of someone who has received information that has changed the dimensions of what they were already working on. She sat down across from Margaret. "The recipient of Fitch's transfer," she said. "We've confirmed the broker's client list. One of the clients, a regular going back 4 years, is a private security contracting firm." She paused. "They specialize in vetting and personnel assessment for federal contracts. Their business model depends on having access to documentation that isn't in official channels." Margaret looked at her steadily. "The kind of documentation," Calloway said, "that includes the classified service records of military veterans who've transitioned to civilian careers and have federal contractor access." The conference room was very quiet. "He didn't know what he had," Margaret said slowly. "On you specifically?" "No. He knew you had a prior military background. The letters from Leon Teller made that clear. He probably flagged it as potentially useful without understanding the specific nature of your service record." Calloway's voice was careful. "The broker would have assessed the value once they had it. And they would have understood it." "Yes." She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Her service record, not the full classified file, she doubted that was accessible. But enough. Enough to know the nature of her deployments, the units she'd worked alongside, the specific capabilities she'd demonstrated in specific environments. In the hands of a private contractor with federal clients, that information was not abstractly dangerous. It was concretely dangerous, in ways she could map specifically if she chose to spend the next few minutes doing so. She chose not to do so right now because thinking about it would produce an adrenaline response she didn't currently have the utility for. "What's the status of the broker?" she said. "Federal investigation as of 2 hours ago," Calloway said. "That's all I can tell you." "And the contractor?" "Same timeline." Margaret nodded. She was very still. The stillness wasn't calm. It was the specific discipline of someone who has been in situations where stillness was the only available option and has made it a reflex. "Is there a current risk to me or my family?" she said. Calloway looked at her directly. "We don't believe so. The breach happened hours ago, and the investigation is active. The broker's operations are being shut down." She paused. "I won't tell you there's zero risk. I'll tell you we're monitoring, and we'll tell you immediately if that assessment changes." Margaret accepted that. It was honest, which was worth more than false reassurance. She was processing the full geometry of what she'd just been told, the layering of it, Fitch on top of something older and larger, her service record in a file somewhere it had no business being, the chain from a parking garage in Delwood, Oregon to a federal contractor she'd never heard of. When the conference room door opened without a knock, it was Rush. His face was doing something. She'd been reading him all morning, developing a working model of his expressions, and what his face was doing now was different from anything she'd seen on it. Not alarm, not operational alarm anyway, but something personal, something that had come through whatever channel he used to separate his professional bearing from whatever lived underneath it. Leon's brother had a complication, he said. Bay 3. He went into secondary arrest about 10 minutes ago. They're working him. Margaret was already standing. They have Greaves, Rush started. Where's Leon? In the bay with him. They wouldn't let him. He stopped because she was already past him through the door. De Marcel. The ER corridor was moving at the speed. Corridors move when something has gone wrong in a bay. Controlled urgency. The specific traffic pattern of people who know where they're going and are going there fast without running because running is its own kind of dangerous in a clinical space. Margaret read the direction of the movement and followed the center of it. Bay 3 had its curtain fully drawn. From outside it she could hear the monitor, the voice of the attending, not Greaves, a different voice, which meant a shift change had happened, or Greaves had been pulled for something else, and the compression of voices that happened when multiple people were working the same problem simultaneously. She could hear Leon's voice saying something short and controlled from somewhere to the right of the bay, outside the curtain where the family waiting space was. She went to Leon first. He was standing against the wall in the narrow space beside the bay, his arms crossed over his chest, his face doing something she recognized from field situations, the specific expression of a person who is applying all of their self-control to the fact that they cannot control what is happening on the other side of a barrier. What happened? She said. They were adjusting his medication. The cardiologist Pallister called in a change. They were implementing it. And Marcus, his pressure tanked and his rhythm, Leon's jaw was tight. They said secondary arrest, which I don't know what that... It means his heart stopped again and they're working to restart it. She said it plainly because he needed plain. It's serious. They're doing what needs to be done. She looked at the curtain. Who's the attending? Ramos. Dr. Ramos. She knew Ramos. She knew Ramos the same way she knew the floor plan and the shift patterns and the signal quality and the gift shop alcove from 11 years of accumulation. Ramos was good. Ramos was better than good in a secondary arrest because he stayed mechanical in the way that emergency medicine required you to stay mechanical, focused on the protocol and not the person, which was a harder thing than people outside the field understood. He's in the right hands, she said. You said that this morning, and he was fine this morning. And now he's not. She held that. He wasn't wrong. Leon. She waited until he looked at her directly. Your brother survived a blast injury in 2009 that killed 2 of the people beside him. He survived incomplete spinal decompression and autonomic dysreflexia complications for 17 years. He drove 4 hours to be here today so that you could find me, which means his judgment about what's worth the physical cost is... She stopped. That was too much. She was telling him things she'd assumed from context, and she was telling them to a man whose brother might be dying 10 feet away, and the relevant part was not the biography. Sorry, she said. The relevant thing is that Ramos is good. I know, Leon said. I know he's good. I know everybody in this place is good. His voice was controlled, but not comfortable. I spent 11 years trying to find the person who kept my brother alive the first time, and I found her this morning, and 4 hours later I'm standing in this corridor, and... He stopped. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Sorry, that's not... Don't apologize. I was going to tell him today, Leon said, that we found you. He knows the story. He was awake the whole time you were working on him this morning. He didn't know who you were to me. I was going to tell him. She looked at him. She had spent 31 years becoming someone who held the weight of other people's outcomes without letting the holding break her, because that was the job. That was the actual job, not the clinical protocols or the documentation or the overtime policy, but the specific human labor of standing in corridors like this one and carrying what needed carrying while someone else got to be the one who fell apart. She was good at it. She'd been good at it for long enough that she'd stopped tracking when the skill became second nature. But she was also 62 years old and had been awake since before midnight and had been fired and rehired and had her classified service record handled by a private data broker. And Leon Teller was standing in front of her with something in his face that was asking for something she didn't have a clinical term for. She put her hand on his arm, once, briefly. "Wait here," she said. She went to the curtain. She didn't push through it. She was not the attending. She was not on this patient. She was a charge nurse on the cardiac floor, and this was the ER, and she had no clinical authority in Bay 3 right now. But there was a gap in the curtain, a 2-inch overlap that wasn't sealed, and she looked through it. She could see Ramos and 2 ER nurses and a tech. She could see the monitor. She could see Marcus Teller's face, which was the color of old paper, but which was... She looked at the monitor, which was showing a rhythm. Irregular. Narrow, complex. But a rhythm. She watched Ramos's hands. She watched the monitor. She counted. 12 seconds. 15. The rhythm held. She let out a breath that came from somewhere she hadn't known was clenched. She turned back to Leon. "He's got a rhythm," she said. "It's not clean, but it's there." Something happened in Leon's face that she wasn't going to describe. She looked away to give him a moment with it. When she looked back, his eyes were wet, and he wasn't doing anything about it, which she respected. He said, "Is that..." "It's good," she said. "It's not finished, but it's good." He nodded. He uncrossed his arms. He put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone coming down from something they hadn't had a name for until it started to lift. She stood beside him in the narrow corridor space, and they were quiet together, which was not uncomfortable. Outside the curtain, she could hear Ramos giving orders in a measured voice, and the movement of the team adjusting, and the monitor marking time in its particular language. She was thinking about Patrick and the dinner he'd said he'd have ready, and about the reinstatement letter with her signature on it now sitting in Director Noel's office, and about Calloway's voice saying federal investigation as of 2 hours ago when her phone vibrated. She looked at it. The message was from Keisha, and it read, "You need to come upstairs, now. Not an emergency, but you need to see this." She read it twice. Keisha had a specific, reliable relationship with urgency. She didn't understate things, and she didn't overstate them, which was why Margaret had trusted her with the consultation room and the cleared corridor and every other small operational task of this morning. When Keisha said, "You need to see this," Margaret believed her. She looked at Leon. "I need to go upstairs for a few minutes. Ramos will come out to update you when there's something to update." "Okay," he said. He wasn't entirely back yet, but he was tracking. She went to the elevator, and on the way she typed back to Keisha. "On my way." "What is it?" Keisha's reply came as the elevator doors were opening. "Someone's here, says she worked with Fitch before, at the Idaho hospital. She came on her own. She's been sitting in the lobby for an hour waiting to talk to whoever is in charge of the investigation." Margaret stepped into the elevator. "There's something else," Keisha typed. "She brought documentation. Hard copies. She said she's been keeping them for 2 years waiting for a situation like this. She also says she's not alone. She says there are 4 others coming, all nurses, all from Fitch's previous hospitals." The elevator doors closed. Margaret looked at her phone in the small humming box of the elevator and felt something shift in the floor of the day. The specific movement of a situation that she had understood as having a particular size and shape, revealing that its actual dimensions were different and larger and more consequential than the version she'd been working with all morning. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Across the lobby, near the main entrance, a woman of perhaps 55 sat in one of the chairs near the window with a manila folder on her lap and the specific posture of someone who has been waiting a very long time for the right moment and has decided, this morning, that the moment is now. She looked up. She looked at Margaret. And she stood, and she came across the lobby, and behind her, through the glass front of the building, Margaret could see a car pulling into the drop-off lane, and another behind it, and a woman getting out of the first one who had the walk of someone who has been carrying something and is ready to put it down. Margaret's phone buzzed again. It was Calloway. "The data broker's client list. We have names. One of them is a hospital board member, not former. Current. Vantage General." The woman's name was Sandra Pruitt, and she'd driven from Boise without stopping except once for gas, which she'd paid for in cash because she'd read enough about data trails in the last 2 years to be careful about them. She was 56, with the compact, self-contained energy of someone who had spent a long time being angry in a productive direction. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a manila folder that was 3 inches thick and rubber-banded twice. And she held it the way people hold things they've kept safe for longer than they expected to need to. She extended her hand to Margaret in the lobby and said, "You're Oakes." "Yes." "They told me you'd been reinstated." Something moved in her face, relief, or something close to it, the releasing of a specific held tension. "I've been watching the news on my phone in the car. Delwood Local. They're saying there were military vehicles at Vantage General this morning." "Word travels," Margaret said. "I've been waiting for word to travel for 2 years." Sandra looked at the folder in her hands. "I was at Brennan Regional in Idaho. Callaway's people mentioned it?" "They did. Fitch came in January 2021. I was nursing director. By September, I was—" She stopped, recalibrating. "He built a file on me. My clinical decisions going back 6 years selectively edited, my overtime, a patient complaint from 2019 that had been investigated and closed and somehow reopened." She paused. "He had access to things that weren't in the hospital's system, things from before I worked at Brennan, from a previous employer." She looked at Margaret steadily. "I didn't understand how until 8 months ago when a friend in the industry mentioned a data broker who'd been approached by an attorney looking to settle a malpractice case with information that shouldn't have been publicly available." Margaret felt the shape of it clicking into place with an audibility that was almost physical. "He wasn't just building files at each hospital," Margaret said. "He was feeding them." Sandra's voice was even and hard in the way of something that has been held at that temperature for a long time. What he built at each facility went into the same pipeline, and what came back out could be used at the next facility to do the same thing faster. She looked at the lobby around them, the hospital morning preceding its normal transactions at the check-in desk and the elevator bank. He didn't have to start from scratch at each place. He arrived with a portfolio. The woman from the first car had come through the main entrance now. She was younger than Sandra, perhaps 45, with a hospital ID from a facility in Nevada still clipped to her coat from force of habit. She stopped when she saw Margaret and Sandra together, and her face did the specific thing of someone who has been moving toward something uncertain and has found it more real than expected. "Are you Oakes?" she said. "Yes." "Marlene Voss. I was at St. Croix Methodist." She looked at Sandra. "I got Sandra's message this morning. I was already coming." "How did you know to come?" Margaret said. "Russia's people called me yesterday," Marlene said. "They said they were looking into Fitch's pattern and asked if I'd be willing to speak with an investigator." She paused. "I said I'd been willing to speak with an investigator for 3 years. They said they'd call back. Then this morning happened and I was already in the car." Through the glass front of the building, the second car was emptying. 2 women and a man moving toward the entrance with the determined pace of people who have been building toward a moment and recognize it when it arrives. Margaret looked at Callaway's message on her phone. A board member. Current. She looked at Sandra Pruitt's folder. 3 inches, rubber-banded twice, carried from Boise in a single overnight drive. She looked at the people coming through the entrance doors. "I need to make a call," she said to Sandra. "Stay here. I'm going to get you in front of Callaway in the next 15 minutes. "I've been waiting 2 years, Sandra said. 15 minutes is fine." Callaway answered on the first ring. "The board member," Margaret said, standing in the alcove by the gift shop, her voice low. "Who is it?" A pause. "Miss Oakes, I shouldn't—" "Agent Callaway." She kept her voice level. "There are 5 people in my lobby right now who drove here from 3 different states with physical documentation of Fitch's conduct at previous facilities. They came because they heard something was finally happening. Before I put them in a room with you, I need to know if the person who runs the governance of this hospital is going to walk into that same room and shut it down." Another pause. Longer. "Harlan Briggs," Callaway said. Margaret knew the name. Everyone at Vantage General knew the name. Harlan Briggs was the chair of the hospital's board of directors, a position he'd held for 7 years, a man who appeared at the annual fundraiser and the capital campaign events and the ribbon-cutting photographs with the practiced ease of someone who understood institutional visibility. He was in his late 60s. Retired from a commercial real estate career that had generated the kind of wealth that made hospital board membership a philanthropic gesture rather than a professional aspiration. He had been the one who approved Roland Fitch's appointment. "Has he been contacted?" Margaret said. "Not yet. We're preparing to move this morning." "When?" "Within the hour. We need the documentation from the witnesses you have in your lobby first." Calloway's voice had shifted slightly. A fraction more direct, a fraction less procedural. "Ms. Oakes, I want to be clear about something. Briggs's connection to the broker is financial, not operational. He was a client. He used their services to vet potential business partners. We don't yet know if he understood the nature of the sourcing, but he benefited from it." "Yes. And he approved the appointment of the man who was sourcing it." "Yes." Calloway said it flatly, because that was the only way to say it. "That's what we're establishing." "Okay," Margaret said. "I'm sending these people to your conference room now. I want to be in that room." A brief pause. "That's not standard." "Calloway?" She said the name the way she said the names of residents who were about to make a decision she needed them to reconsider. "I've spent 31 years in this building. I know every person on Fitch's list, either directly or by reputation. I can tell you which documentation is legitimate and which has been edited, because I was there for most of it. Put me in the room." Calloway was quiet for 3 seconds. "Third floor conference room," she said. 20 minutes. What happened in that conference room over the next 90 minutes was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was the specific, grinding, necessary work of truth being documented in a form that would hold weight in rooms where documentation was the currency. Sandra Pruitt's folder contained, among other things, a timeline she'd built over 2 years cross-referencing dates of Fitch's personnel decisions against dates of data transfers she'd traced through a Freedom of Information request that had taken 11 months to fulfill. She had emails, printed and time-stamped, showing communications between Fitch's personal account and an address that Calloway's people recognized before Sandra finished explaining it. She had the original patient complaint from 2019 with its closure documentation, and beside it a photocopy of the reopened version with annotations in Sandra's handwriting marking every alteration. Marlene Voss had something different, a USB drive that she placed on the table without preamble and said, "I've had this for 18 months. It's a copy of Fitch's personal calendar from his time at St. Croix. His assistant gave it to me when she left the hospital. She was afraid to go to anyone official. She said she'd testify if it ever came to it." "Where is she now?" Calloway asked. "Portland. She'll take your call." Marlene looked at the USB drive. The calendar shows meetings, regular, off-site. The location codes match an address in Reno that I later identified as the broker's registered office. The third woman from the parking lot was named Deb Tanaka, a pharmacist from a facility in Colorado, where Fitch had briefly consulted rather than held a permanent role. She hadn't been targeted herself, but she'd watched it happen to others, and she'd kept notes. Not for any particular planned purpose, she said, but because keeping notes was how she processed things that disturbed her, and what Fitch had done to a nursing director named Carl Weston had disturbed her significantly. Weston had left the field entirely and was now working in insurance. The man from the parking lot was Weston. He was quiet through most of the session, which Margaret understood. He sat with his hands folded on the table and he answered Calloway's questions in a voice that was functional and accurate and carried something underneath it that had the weight of years. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the documentation alterations. He confirmed specific conversations with Fitch that he'd also written down, immediately afterward, in a notebook he'd kept in a locked drawer and brought with him today. "Why did you leave?" Calloway asked him. "Because I didn't know how to prove it," Weston said. "I knew what he had on me. I knew it was altered. I knew the incident it referenced hadn't happened the way it was described. But when you're looking at documentation that looks official and has your name on it and the institution's stamp on it, and the person showing it to you controls your employment status, the calculation becomes..." He paused. "It becomes about survival." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's what he was counting on," Margaret said. Weston looked at her. "Yes. With all of us. Yes." He picked up his notebook, then set it back down. "Does it help that we're here?" "It helps enormously," Calloway said. "I need to be clear about what happens from here. The federal investigation is active, the broker's operations are being shut down, and we're moving to interview Mr. Briggs today. Your documentation becomes part of the evidentiary record. You may be contacted again by investigators or prosecutors. She looked around the table. This isn't finished yet, but what you've brought here today significantly changes the scope of what we're able to do. Sandra Pruitt looked at her folder sitting open on the table, its contents spread across 2 feet of conference table surface. Is there a chance any of this gets buried? She said. Briggs has money. Fitch is already lawyered up, I assume. He is, Calloway said. And yes, money influences outcomes. I won't pretend it doesn't. She paused. But the classification of what this became, the nature of the data that was being moved, the federal contractor connection, that takes it out of the category of things that can be managed quietly at the institutional level. This is a federal case now. Sandra nodded, absorbing that. She looked at Margaret. What happens to you? I've been reinstated, Margaret said. That's it? They fire you and you come back and that's the resolution? No, Margaret said. That's the beginning of the resolution. The rest of it is going to take time, and it's going to be public, and it's going to be messy, the way these things are. Are you okay with messy? Margaret thought about that. She was 62 years old. She'd spent 11 years before Vantage General in conditions that redefined what the word messy could contain. She'd spent 31 years after that being precise and careful, and building something solid in a building on the edge of a small city in Oregon. She'd been fired this morning at 5:47 in front of her coworkers, with a paper coffee cup in her hand. I've been okay with messy before, she said. Calloway left the conference room at 11:50 with the documentation, photographed, logged, and transported in a sealed evidence bag that had appeared from somewhere in the material her team had brought in. She said she'd be in contact with each of the witnesses within 48 hours. She said the investigation's next phase was beginning now, which Margaret understood to mean that someone was picking up a phone to call Harlan Briggs. Sandra Pruitt found a hotel 3 blocks from the hospital because Calloway had asked her to remain available. Marlene Voss had a cousin in Delwood and went there. Deb Tanaka and Carl Weston sat in the hospital cafeteria with coffee they'd earned and the specific exhausted relief of people who have just put down something heavy for the first time in a long time. Margaret went to check on Marcus Teller. He was out of danger. Ramos had stabilized him through the secondary arrest with a drug protocol adjustment that was now being reviewed with the cardiologist Pallister in a phone conference that had been going for 20 minutes. The monitor showed a rhythm she could work with. Marcus himself was awake, less pale, and had developed an opinion about the hospital's jello that he was expressing to Leon with some specificity when Margaret appeared at the curtain. She took the chart from the rack outside. She had her authorization back. The badge that Keisha had somehow already had reprinted and delivered to the 3rd floor was in her pocket with the reinstatement letter, and she read what Ramos had documented. You're going to be here overnight, she told Marcus through the curtain gap. I gathered that, Marcus said. Tomorrow maybe, depending on what Pallister decides about the medication change. That's... He paused. Fine. It's fine. His voice said it wasn't entirely fine, but that he was managing it, which was the most anyone could reasonably ask. She looked at Leon, who was standing on the other side of the gurney, looking like a man who had been through several things in one morning. You should eat something, she said. I'm not hungry. That's not what I said. He looked at her. Something briefly close to amusement moved across his face. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was what Darius Webb had said, and she filed that without comment. She went back to the 3rd floor. Mom. The afternoon had its own texture, different from the morning. The morning had been crisis and revelation, and the particular electricity of things cracking open. The afternoon was the specific work of a floor that needed to function regardless of what had happened to its charge nurse before dawn, and it needed her in it. She took report from Lorraine, who gave it concisely and completely, and with the slightly heightened precision of someone who understood they were being observed. Margaret didn't correct her on anything, because there was nothing to correct. She made her rounds. She checked the documentation on Darius Webb's chart and found the cardiology priority flag in place, which meant Lorraine had moved on it immediately, which was worth something. Darius Webb was awake and on the phone with his mother, who had arrived while Margaret was in the conference room and was apparently managing her response to the morning's events by rearranging the objects on his bedside table, which he was narrating to whoever was on the other end of the call. He looked up when Margaret appeared, held up one finger, said something into the phone, and hung up. "Dr. Pallister's office called," he said. "They're scheduling me for a full cardiac workup next week." "Good." They said it might mean a procedure, some kind of ablation, they called it. "Possibly. Pallister will explain the options." He looked at her with the evaluating look of someone assessing information they don't fully have a framework for yet. "Is that serious?" "It's manageable," she said. "The fact that they're catching it now, at 29, means you have significantly more options than if it had continued undetected." "Right." He absorbed that. "The nurse who came in this morning, not you, the other one, she said something happened with the hospital's administration, that there were investigators here." "There are." "Is that connected to—" He stopped. "I don't know how to ask this without sounding like I think everything is about me." "It's connected to why I was available to be here last night," she said, "and this morning, and why it was a more complicated morning than expected." She looked at him evenly. "It's not about you, but you're part of what made it matter." He was quiet for a moment. "My sergeant," he said, "from my second deployment. He was at this hospital 2 months ago, cardiac thing. He said it was the best he'd received since the VA. That's why I came here." She hadn't known that. There was no way to have known it. She stood in the doorway of room 318 and felt the particular sensation of understanding that things connect in ways that aren't visible from the inside of them. The way Darius Webb had ended up here because of a word-of-mouth recommendation that traced back to the specific quality of care on a specific floor. The way that quality connected to a woman who had been fired at 5:47 in the morning and come back anyway. "Rest," she said. "Your mom looks like she's about to reorganize your IV tubing." He laughed, short and surprised. "She rearranged my entire apartment when I deployed, both times. I came back to a completely different layout. Sounds like someone who needed something to do with her hands." "Yeah." His voice softened. "Yeah, that's exactly what it was." She went back to the corridor. The call came at 2:17. She was at the nurse's station reviewing the afternoon's admission queue when her phone vibrated and she looked at it and didn't recognize the number and almost let it go to voicemail, and then took it because the area code was local, and local unknowns sometimes mattered. "Ms. Oakes." A man's voice, measured and careful, with the deliberate warmth of someone who had practiced this opening. "My name is Harlan Briggs. I'm the chair of Vantage General's board of directors." She was quiet for 2 seconds. "Mr. Briggs, I want to reach out personally to express, well, to begin with, to express how deeply sorry I am for what happened this morning. The manner in which your employment was terminated was wrong, and—" "Mr. Briggs," she said. He stopped. "Are you aware that you're currently under federal investigation?" A long pause. Whatever he'd prepared for this call, it apparently hadn't been that opening. I've been made aware that there are some questions I've asked my attorney." "Because I'm not the person you should be calling," she said, "and I think you probably know that." Another pause. "Ms. Oakes, I want you to understand that my involvement that any association I had with outside services was in the context of legitimate due diligence for board level." "I'm going to stop you there," she said, and she said it the way she said it to residents who were heading toward clinical decisions that were going to cause harm, not unkindly, but with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. "I'm not an attorney. I'm a charge nurse, and whatever you're trying to accomplish with this call, you should be having that conversation with someone who can actually help you." She paused. "Which I can't." She hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Around her, the nurse's station continued its afternoon rhythm. Keyboards, the movement of the medication cart, the distant notification of a call light from the far end of the corridor. Completely ordinary, completely intact. She called Calloway. "Briggs just called me," she said. A pause. Then, "He did what?" "Called me directly, started to make statements." She looked at the ceiling briefly. "I told him to talk to his attorney," and hung up. A longer pause. "Thank you for calling me." Calloway's voice had the particular flat quality of someone managing a reaction. "We are, as of 45 minutes ago, in the process of formally interviewing him. The fact that he made contact with a witness—" "I know what it is," Margaret said. "I know you do." A breath. "We're going to need you to document that call. Time, content, your exact response. Can you do that now?" "Yes." She wrote it in the same notebook she'd been using since the morning, the small, spiral-bound one she kept in her scrub pocket, that was supposed to be for clinical notes, and had ended up containing the architecture of a day she hadn't anticipated. She documented it in the flat, precise language of clinical documentation: time, parties involved, content summary, her response, duration. Then she photographed it and sent it to Calloway's number. She went back to work. The disclosure happened at 4 o'clock. She found out about it the way most of the hospital found out about it, through the notice that appeared on the staff intranet portal, which Keisha texted her about before she'd had a chance to check it herself. Margaret read the text, read the portal, and stood in the medication room reading it twice. The notice was from Director Noel, and it was formal and careful, and had clearly been written in consultation with the hospital's legal team. But what it said, stripped of the institutional language, was this: Roland Fitch had been terminated from his position as Director of Clinical Operations, effective immediately, pending a federal investigation into conduct that included improper data handling, personnel file manipulation, and potential violations of HIPAA's administrative provisions. The hospital was cooperating fully with federal investigators. A board review was underway regarding governance oversight. Affected staff members would be contacted individually. There was a second notice beneath it, shorter, that said the hospital's Nursing Staff Recognition Committee would be scheduling a formal session to review and correct personnel records affected by the recent administrative irregularities. Margaret read both notices twice. Then she put her phone away and finished the medication reconciliation she'd been in the middle of. At 4:30, Keisha appeared in the medication room doorway. "The ER nurses are talking," Keisha said. "Third floor is talking. I think the entire hospital is talking." "People talk," Margaret said. "They're saying Briggs is being investigated." "People are saying a lot of things. Are they wrong?" Margaret looked at her. "No." Keisha let out a slow breath. She'd been on since the night before and should have gone home hours ago and hadn't, which Margaret had noticed and not addressed because there was no addressing it. Keisha stayed for the same reason Margaret stayed, which was the irreducible commitment of someone who understood that what happened in this building mattered. What happens to Briggs? That depends on what the investigation finds. But it's not going to be... Keisha searched for the word. "It's not going to be quiet." "No," Margaret said. "It's not going to be quiet." Keisha nodded, working through it. She'd been in this hospital for 14 years. She'd worked under Fitch's operational restructuring for 3 of them, adapting to the overtime policy and the documentation requirements, and the particular climate of a floor that knew something was wrong but couldn't name it precisely. She had the specific weariness of someone who had been correct about something for a long time without having the vocabulary to prove it. "Good," she said finally. Just that. She went back to the floor. All right. Leon came up to the 3rd floor at 5:15. Marcus was being transferred from the ER to a monitored bed for overnight observation. Good news, the kind that had taken most of the day to become reliable. And Leon had watched the transfer and then, apparently, found himself at loose ends in a building he had no other reason to be in except for the woman who'd spent the morning at the center of everything. He found Margaret at the nurse's station and stood on the other side of the counter in the posture of someone who's not sure of the protocol. "I wanted to say something before He stopped. "Marcus is going to stay overnight. The cardiologist is coming in tomorrow morning. I'll be here for that." "That's good. I have a room at the Best Western on 5th. He said it with the slight awkwardness of a man providing logistical information he's not sure anyone asked for. "So I'll be around if anything—" "Leon," she said. He stopped. "What did you want to say?" He looked at her, and whatever the 12 hours had done to him was visible in his face. The compressed weight of it, the relief and the residual fear, and the fatigue of a man who had driven 4 hours with a hope he'd been carrying for 11 years and arrived to find the day considerably more complex than hope usually prepares you for. "I wanted to say thank you," he said, "and I wanted to say I'm sorry." The letters. The letters. And just that you did what you did in that field hospital and you walked away from it and you came here and built something and someone spent 3 years trying to take it from you and using the fact that you'd served as a... He stopped. I know that's not your fault. I know it's not connected to, but I needed to say it. Because without what you did 11 years ago, I don't have my brother. I don't have the life I've had since. And whatever they put you through because of me finding you, I'm sorry. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't put me through anything, she said. Fitch put me through it. Briggs enabled it. You drove 4 hours and sat in a parking lot and called someone from the ER when your brother collapsed. She paused. That's not the same category. No, he said. But, she agreed. They looked at each other across the counter of the nurse's station with 11 years and a very long day between them, and not quite the language for it, which was all right. Some things didn't require full language. She'd been long enough in situations where words were expensive to know that their absence wasn't always a deficit. Go get dinner, she said. You've been in this building since 6 this morning. So have you. I work here, she said. You don't. A pause. Come back in the morning for Marcus's consult. Bring coffee. I take it black. Something in his face settled the way something that has been held at an angle finally levels. Yes, ma'am, he said. She watched him go toward the elevator. She watched him press the button and wait, and she noticed that he pressed it only once and then stood patiently, which told her something about the kind of person he was that she already knew from 11 years ago and was just confirming. The elevator came. He got in. The doors closed. She turned back to the nurse's station and found Lorraine standing 3 feet away, trying very visibly not to have been watching. Chart update on web, Margaret said. The priority flag. Did Pallister's office confirm the appointment time? Yes, Lorraine said, recovering. Next Tuesday, 1 o'clock. Document that he knows. Get verbal confirmation from him and put it in the chart. Okay. Lorraine paused. Ms. Oakes, the notice on the portal, the part about affected staff members being contacted, does that include you? Technically, I'm already resolved, Margaret said. The reinstatement covers my situation. But will they? Is there going to be? Lorraine was searching for the right shape of what she was asking. Is someone going to say publicly what he did? To you specifically? To the others? Or does it just get documented in a federal file somewhere? It was a real question. It was the real question, actually. The one that had been sitting under the day's events since the conference room session that morning. Margaret considered it honestly. That depends on the investigation, she said, and on what Director Noel decides to do publicly with what's been found. She looked at Lorraine. Why? Because people should know, Lorraine said, with a directness that surprised Margaret slightly, the way young people surprised her when they said what they meant without the hedging she'd come to expect. The nurses he removed. They should be named. What he did to them should be... She stopped. I just think it matters. Whether it's public. It does matter, Margaret said. Then I hope it happens. So do I. She went back to the chart she'd been reviewing because the floor didn't stop for any of it. It didn't stop for firings or reinstatements or federal investigations or 11-year-old debts being paid in hospital lobbies. It kept its rhythm, and the rhythm was patience and documentation and the 1,000 small decisions that added up over 31 years to a kind of life. At 6:40, her phone buzzed. Calloway. She answered it. Briggs has requested an emergency board meeting, Calloway said. He's calling it himself, which is, well, it tells you something about his read of the situation. What's his read? That he can manage it internally before the federal case proceeds to a point where internal management isn't possible. A pause. He's wrong about that, but the board meeting is scheduled for 8 o'clock tonight. Margaret processed that. Here? At the hospital? Yes. The main conference room. Board members are being called in. Another pause. We'll have people present. It's a formal institutional meeting. He can't exclude investigators at this stage. Is there anything you need from me? Not tonight. Calloway's voice shifted slightly. But I want to give you the option to be informed. If the board meeting produces what I expect it to produce, you'll know before 10 o'clock tonight. A pause. We think he's going to attempt to frame this as Fitch acting alone. Use tonight's meeting to establish board distance from the investigation and position himself as the person who took corrective action. Will it work? Not with what we have, Calloway said, but he doesn't know the full extent of what we have. Margaret thought about Sandra Pruitt's folder on the conference table. She thought about Marlene Voss's USB drive. She thought about Carl Weston's notebook and the 7 years of documentation that Calloway's team had spent the day processing and cross-referencing. Okay, she said, let me know. She went back to the floor. The evening shift change happened at 7. Margaret gave report to the incoming charge nurse, a woman named Fiona who had the steady reliability of someone who had been doing this long enough to not be surprised by anything. And she did it with the complete, unsparing accuracy she always brought to it, covering every patient, every flag, every pending consult. It took 22 minutes. She didn't cut corners because the day had been what it had been. The patients didn't know what the day had been. She was putting on her coat in the locker room when Keisha found her again. "You're leaving?" Keisha said. "My shift ended 7 hours ago." "Right." Keisha leaned against the locker. "How are you?" Margaret thought about the question, which Keisha asked rarely enough that it deserved an honest answer. "Tired," she said, "functioning." "What about—" Keisha made a vague gesture that encompassed the day, all of it. "It's moving," Margaret said. "The right direction, slowly." "Slowly," Keisha repeated. "These things are slow," Margaret said. "The morning was fast. The rest of it is slow." She put her coat on. "Are you going home?" "In a bit." "Keisha, go home." "I will." She pushed off the locker. "Ms. Oakes, the people from the other hospitals, Sandra Pruitt and the others, are they going to be okay? Like, actually, not procedurally." Margaret considered it. Carl Weston's face in the conference room. The specific exhausted quality of a man who had stopped being a nursing director because someone with a laptop and a pipeline had made him a liability. The way Sandra Pruitt had held that folder with both hands. "Some of them," she said honestly. "It depends on what the investigation recovers and what gets made public, and whether the right people decide that naming what happened is worth the institutional discomfort of naming it." She looked at Keisha directly. "Which is not guaranteed." "That's not a good answer." "No," Margaret said, "but it's the true one." She walked out of the locker room and through the third-floor corridor into the elevator. She rode down to the lobby. She walked across the lobby floor toward the main entrance, past the chair where Sandra Pruitt had sat that morning with her folder, past the cafe that was closed for the evening, past the check-in desk where the night staff were settling into their rhythm. She pushed through the main entrance and stood on the hospital steps. The evening was cool, and the parking lot was quieter than the morning had been. The particular quiet of a shift transition when the day's intensity has been handed off, but the night's hasn't yet fully arrived. The air smelled like rain that hadn't started yet. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. No introduction, just, "You should know that Briggs has been building a case against Director Knoll for 18 months. He's planning to use tonight's board meeting to replace her. He has documentation. Some of it is real. Some of it isn't. He thinks she's the variable he can't control." She read it twice. She called Calloway. "I just received a text," she said. "Unknown number. You need to hear it." She read it aloud. There was a silence on the other end that was not Calloway pausing to think. It was Calloway absorbing something that changed a dimension of what she was already working with. "Who sent it?" Calloway said. "I don't know." "Can you forward it?" "Yes." She did it while she was still on the call. "Ms. Oakes." Calloway's voice had changed in the way voices change when something that looked like an endpoint has opened into a corridor. "The board meeting is in 70 minutes. If Briggs moves to replace Noel tonight using manufactured documentation in a meeting that is already under federal observation." "He's accelerating," Margaret said. "He's not managing it. He's trying to get ahead of it." "Yes." "Which means he doesn't know you have what you have." "Correct." A pause. "Or he does know, and he thinks he can move faster than we can." Margaret stood on the hospital steps in the cool pre-rain air and thought about Harlan Briggs, a man she'd seen at fundraising events and ribbon-cutting photographs for 7 years. A man who had approved the appointment of Roland Fitch. A man who had called her this afternoon with the careful warmth of someone trying to manage a situation he'd misjudged the size of. She thought about the unknown number that had just texted her. "Calloway," she said. "The text. Someone inside sent it." "I know. Someone in that building who knows what Briggs is planning tonight decided to warn me specifically." She paused. "Why me?" Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the one he can't categorize," she said. "Fitch targeted you because you were a liability. Briggs called you because he thought you were manageable. Someone on that board, or in that administration, has been watching this morning and thinks you're the one person in this situation who can't be leveraged." A pause. "They're not wrong." Margaret stood on the steps. In 70 minutes, in the main conference room of this building, a man who had spent 7 years controlling the governance of Vantage General was going to walk into a room that he thought was the last place he still had the advantage, and he was going to move against the one person in the hospital's administration who had spent the day doing the right thing. Her phone buzzed again, the same unknown number. This time it said, "He's already in the building. He came early. He's meeting with 2 board members right now in the executive boardroom on the 2nd floor. I can hear them. He's telling them Noel authorized the data transfers." Margaret looked at the building in front of her. She called Calloway back. "He's already inside," she said. "He's on the 2nd floor right now. You need to move." Calloway said, "We're 5 minutes out." "He doesn't have 5 minutes," Margaret said. "If he gets those 2 board members before you get in that room, he has a majority block, and he can move before the meeting is formally called. That's how board procedure works." She paused. "I'm already on the steps." A silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Go," Calloway said. She went back through the main entrance at a walk that was not quite running, which was a choice. Running produced a different response in a building at shift change, drew the wrong attention, accelerated the wrong things. She walked with the pace of someone who knows exactly where she's going and has calculated that urgency and visibility are not the same thing. The executive boardroom was on the 2nd floor, east wing, in the administrative cluster that shared a corridor with Noel's office and the hospital's legal department. Margaret had been in it 3 times in 31 years, twice for union consultations, once for a budget review that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the 3rd floor's supply requisition, which Fitch's predecessor had flagged incorrectly. She knew the layout. She knew that the room had a glass panel beside its door, narrow, the kind designed to let people see if the room was occupied before they knocked. She took the stairs. The 2nd floor at 7 in the evening was quieter than the clinical floors, administrative hours, so most of the offices were dark or in low light mode, the kind of after-hours presence that was computers on standby and the occasional assistant catching up on correspondence. The corridor had the muted quality of a building that is between its daytime and nighttime selves. She heard the voices before she saw the light under the boardroom door. Briggs. 2 other voices she didn't immediately recognize, male, measured, the cadence of men being convinced of something. She stopped outside the glass panel and looked through it without moving into the door's sightline. Harlan Briggs was at the head of the table. She'd seen him at hospital events, but not at close range in a functional context. And what she saw now was different from the fundraiser version. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the silver-haired confidence of someone who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for so long that the posture had become structural. He had documents spread in front of him, and he was talking with the focused intensity of a man conducting a triage operation. The 2 board members across from him were names she knew from the hospital's letterhead, Gerald Sato and Frank DeCourcy, both long-serving, both in their 60s, both with the slightly reclined posture of men who were listening rather than agreeing, but had not yet separated the 2. "Noel's authorization codes are on the transfer records," Briggs was saying. "That's not a coincidence. That's her signature on institutional data movement going back to 2020. Fitch was executing, but he wasn't directing. The direction came from—" Margaret pushed the door open. The room went still the way rooms go still when something enters that wasn't expected. A beat of pure adjustment, everyone recalibrating simultaneously. Briggs looked at her. He recognized her. She watched him recognize her, watched the specific movement behind his eyes of a man who had made a phone call 3 hours ago that he now understood differently. "Ms. Oakes," he said. He kept his voice even, which she credited him for. "This is a closed board session." The meeting isn't scheduled until 8, she said. This is a corridor conversation. It's a private… Mr. Sato. She looked at Gerald Sato directly. She'd met him once at a hospital gala 3 years ago, and he'd asked her a genuine question about nursing retention that she'd answered fully, which had seemed to surprise him. Whatever you've been shown in the last 10 minutes about Director Noel's authorization codes, I'd ask you to hold that information until Agent Calloway arrives. Sato looked at Briggs, then at Margaret. Calloway, Department of Defense Inspector General. She's been in this building since this morning. Margaret kept her voice at the same register she used for clinical briefings. Not dramatic, not deferential, just clear and specific. She has documentation that includes the complete transfer records with authorization metadata. If Director Noel's codes appear on those records, there's a question of how they got there. They're her codes, Briggs said. The system requires administrative credentials, Margaret said. It doesn't require that the person named in those credentials be the person who entered them. She looked at Briggs. Fitch had access to administrative systems. That was his role. His own calendar documentation, which has been surrendered to investigators, shows meetings at the data broker's registered office going back to 2021. She paused. The same period as the transfers that carry Director Noel's codes. The room was very quiet. Frank DeCourcy, who hadn't spoken since she entered, said, "How do you know what the calendar shows?" "Because the person who provided it gave her account in a conference room in this building at 10 this morning," Margaret said, along with 4 other former employees of facilities where Roland Fitch previously worked. She looked at DeCourcy evenly. Mr. Fitch had a pattern. He ran it at 3 institutions before this one. The documentation exists, and it's in federal hands. She paused. All of it. Briggs said, "Ms. Oakes, you are not a party to this investigation in any official." "No," she said, "I'm not." She said it without heat, without apology, without any of the qualifying language that he had been counting on from a woman who'd been fired at dawn and reinstated before noon and had every reason to be managing her position carefully. She said it the way she said the things she knew, plainly, with the specific confidence of someone who understands that what they know doesn't become less true depending on who's listening. "I'm the charge nurse on the 3rd floor," she said. "I've been here for 31 years, and I'm telling you what I know." She looked between Sato and DeCourcy. "What you do with it is your decision." The corridor outside the boardroom had the specific quality of approaching sound. Footsteps, more than 2 people, coming up the stairwell. Margaret didn't turn around. She watched Briggs's face, which was doing the arithmetic she'd expected it to do, the calculation of a man who has spent the last hour moving pieces into position and is watching them become irrelevant in real time. The boardroom door opened behind her. Calloway came in with 2 of her people and a man in a dark suit that was not military and not hospital that Margaret hadn't seen before. Rush was behind them. Calloway took in the room in a single assessment. She looked at Briggs. She looked at the documents on the table in front of him. She looked at Margaret, and in the look was something brief and specific that wasn't gratitude exactly, but was its practical equivalent. "Mr. Briggs," Calloway said, "we've been looking for you." What happened in the boardroom over the next 40 minutes was not a confrontation in the dramatic sense. It was more precise than that, and in some ways more complete. Calloway presented, in sequence, the documentation her team had assembled. The broker's client records, the calendar entries, the cross-reference transfer metadata, the witness statements from 5 people who had driven from 3 different states to be in this building today. She presented it with the flat, methodical clarity of someone who had spent 20 years building cases that needed to survive in rooms that were actively hostile to them. Briggs's attorney arrived at 7:20, slightly out of breath. He asked for a pause. Calloway gave him 4 minutes to review the initial materials, which was not as much time as he wanted, but more than he'd expected. At 7:24, he advised Briggs not to speak further, which Briggs accepted with the specific quality of a man who has just understood the actual size of something he had misjudged from the outside. Gerald Sato asked 3 questions. They were good questions, precise, focused on the chain of authorization, on what the metadata actually proved and what it didn't. Calloway answered each one directly. At the end of the 3rd answer, Sato looked at the documents in front of him for a long moment, and then looked at Briggs. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Frank DeCourcy said, "I'd like Director Noel present for the 8 o'clock meeting." He said it to Calloway, not to Briggs, which was its own statement about how the geometry of the room had shifted. "I think that's appropriate." "I'll ensure she's available," Calloway said. At 7:38, Calloway informed Briggs that he was being formally placed under investigation and that his participation in tonight's board meeting was suspended pending legal counsel. She said it quietly, without theater. Briggs's attorney put his hand briefly on Briggs's arm. Not a comfort gesture, a restraint. And Briggs stood slowly and straightened his jacket and walked out of the boardroom with the deliberate, careful movements of a man who has been stripped of his context but hasn't yet decided what to replace it with. Margaret watched him go. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to feel something cleaner than what she actually felt, which was tired and relieved and faintly sad in the specific way you feel sad about things that didn't have to happen and did anyway. 31 years, 5 nurses and a pharmacist who'd driven from 3 different states. Carl Weston, who'd left his field and gone to work in insurance because the alternative had felt impossible. All of it because a man with access to a pipeline had found it easier to remove people than to work beside them. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of what it had cost, and that was the appropriate feeling, and she didn't try to trade it for something lighter. Rush came to stand beside her as the room reorganized around the departure. "You were supposed to wait outside," he said. "You were supposed to be here 5 minutes earlier," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair." The 8 o'clock board meeting happened. Karen Knoll arrived at 7:52 with the expression of someone who had received a phone call that changed the shape of her evening and had not yet had time to fully process the change. She looked at Margaret when she came into the boardroom, and Margaret gave her a nod that contained no particular editorial content, and Knoll accepted it with the grace of someone who had also been awake since long before this day was supposed to start. The meeting was short by board standards. Calloway's presence necessitated a specific kind of procedural clarity that moved things along, and the absence of Briggs from the chair created a vacuum that was filled, somewhat unsteadily, by Gerald Sato as the senior remaining board member. He ran the meeting the way competent people run things they've been handed unexpectedly, imperfectly, but with adequate structure, which was all the situation required. 3 formal decisions came out of it. The first was the immediate suspension of Harlan Briggs from his board position pending the federal investigation, which passed unanimously in the way things pass unanimously when everyone in the room understands the alternative isn't viable. The second was the commissioning of an independent audit of all personnel records flagged in the federal investigation, with the specific mandate that any records altered through the broker pipeline be formally corrected and that affected individuals be notified in writing of the correction and its cause. This passed 6-0. Margaret sat in the back of the room as a non-voting observer that Calloway had authorized, and she listened to the specific language of the motion, affected individuals be notified in writing of the correction and its cause, and thought about Carl Weston in the conference room that morning, and Sandra Pruitt's 2-year drive toward a moment like this. The third decision was a formal public statement to be released through the hospital's communications office within 24 hours, acknowledging the conduct that had occurred under Roland Fitch's administration and the board's commitment to institutional accountability. Knoll drafted the broad outline on her phone during the meeting itself, reading it aloud for board approval, and Frank DeCourcy added 2 sentences that made it more specific and less institutional in tone, which Margaret thought were the better sentences. The meeting ended at 9:17. Margaret sat in the back of the boardroom as people filtered out and thought about nothing in particular for approximately 90 seconds, which was more mental vacancy than she'd had access to all day. Then she picked up her coat and went home. Patrick had made pasta, which was his version of saying he understood the day had been significant without knowing the specifics, and wanted to offer something that required no decisions on her part. She came through the door at 9:45, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and the specific warmth of a house that has been occupied and kept warm by someone waiting in it, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her. He came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She sat at the kitchen table and he sat across from her, and she told him the whole day in order. Briggs in the boardroom, Calloway's documentation, Sandra Pruitt and Carl Weston in the USB drive that Marlene Voss had been holding for 18 months, Marcus Teller's arrest and recovery, Leon's face in the ER corridor, the text from the unknown number, the walk back through the main entrance at 7 o'clock in the evening. She told him about the board meeting and the three motions and the specific language of the second one. She told him about the letters. She watched what that did to him, which was what she'd known it would do. A controlled, sustained anger of the particular kind that Patrick had always carried for specific rather than abstract injustice. The kind that didn't flare and didn't perform itself but settled in and became something structural. 4 letters, he said. 4 that reached the hospital. There may have been others. Over how many years? Rush said Leon started about 2 years after the event. So the first one would have been, she did the math, 9 years ago. Patrick put his hand flat on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on a table. He was keeping them from you for 9 years. We don't know the exact timeline. Calloway's team is establishing it. Approximately 9 years, Maggie. Yes. He looked at his hand on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. How are you? She thought about it honestly, the way she'd thought about Keisha's version of the same question earlier. She was 62 years old and had been awake for approximately 18 hours and had been fired and reinstated and had walked into a boardroom after a 10-minute phone call and held ground in front of a man who had been the most powerful person in her professional ecosystem for 7 years. Her left knee hurt. She had eaten, by her count, 1 granola bar and half a cup of Pella's coffee, both before 9 in the morning. I'm okay, she said. I'm genuinely okay. She paused. That surprises me a little. Why? Because it was a lot of day. You've had a lot of days, he said. He said it simply, without drama, meaning all of it. The 11 years before Vantage General, the 31 years inside it, the particular quality of a life that had been built with the specific discipline of someone who had been places that required it and had brought that discipline home and applied it to everything, including the things that didn't announce themselves as requiring it. I have, she said. He got up and got the pasta and put it in front of her without commentary, and she ate, and they sat in the kitchen with the specific quiet of people who have spent enough time together that silence is a comfortable medium rather than a gap. And outside the window, the rain that had been threatening since evening finally started. She slept for 7 hours, which was more than she'd expected. She woke at 5:42, almost exactly the time she'd been awake the previous morning, which her body had apparently decided was relevant, and lay in the gray pre-dawn for a few minutes before getting up. Patrick was still asleep. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with it and looked at the backyard where the rain had stopped and the morning was coming in damp and quiet between the trees. She read Leon's letter, all of it. He'd written it over 3 days, he said, because he kept starting it wrong. He'd tried the formal version first, official, structured, the kind of letter a soldier writes to someone they owe a debt to. It hadn't been right. Then he'd tried the personal version, and that had been too much in the other direction, too raw, the kind of thing that might land wrong on someone he didn't know outside of 4 specific days a decade ago. The third version was what she was reading. It was neither. It was a man sitting down and saying what was true, without architecture, starting with the specific fact that he remembered her hands. That during the worst of the second day, when he'd been partly conscious and not fully tracking what was happening around him, he had been aware of her hands, working, and that awareness had been the thing he held on to. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. He said his daughter was 7 now. He said her name was May. He said the photograph in his pocket that had survived the field hospital was the one he'd shown May when she was old enough to understand the story, and that she had listened to it with the serious attention of a child who understands that she is being told something about why she exists. He said May had asked if they could ever find the nurse from the story. He said he'd told her they were going to try. Margaret sat with the letter in both hands in the early morning of her kitchen. With coffee she'd let go cold, and let herself feel the full weight of what 9 years of those letters sitting in an administrative mailroom meant. She didn't manage it. She let it be what it was, a grief and an anger, and also, underneath both, something warmer and more durable. The knowledge that someone had written year after year into an address they couldn't be sure anyone was reading, because the alternative was to let a debt go unpaid, and that alternative had been unacceptable to him. The specific human stubbornness of that. The refusal to let the silence win. She folded the letter back into its envelope, She got up and refilled her coffee and called her sister in Portland, who answered on the third ring with the groggy surprise of someone who had not expected a call at 6 in the morning and quickly converted it to genuine attention when she heard Margaret's voice, and Margaret told her the short version, which still took 20 minutes. Her sister said, "Maggie," at several points in the telling, each time with a different weight. At the end she said, "Are you crying?" And Margaret said, "A little. Don't make anything of it." Her sister said, "I'm making something of it." Margaret said, "I know." They stayed on the phone for a few more minutes, and then she hung up and finished her coffee. She arrived at Vantage General at 8:15, which was 45 minutes before her shift technically began, which was the kind of thing she'd done for 31 years, and which felt, this morning, like choosing rather than habit. The hospital's public statement had gone out at 7 o'clock through the communications office. She'd seen it on her phone before she left the house. It was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged that serious administrative misconduct had occurred under Roland Fitch's tenure and that federal investigators had identified a pattern extending beyond Vantage General. The second stated that the hospital's board of directors had commissioned an independent audit of affected personnel records and that all impacted staff members would be individually contacted with formal corrections. The third stated that Director Karen Knoll had the board's full confidence and would be leading the institutional review process. It named Fitch specifically. It named the broker obliquely, with language that the federal case required. It did not name Briggs directly, which was Callaway's constraint, but anyone with the previous day's local news and a capacity for inference could complete that sentence. By the time Margaret came through the main entrance at 8:15, the statement had been out for 75 minutes, which was long enough for the hospital to be different than it had been the day before in a way that wasn't just about the events themselves, but about the public accounting of them. The check-in desk nurse said, "Good morning, Ms. Oakes," in a way that was not different in words from any other morning, but was different in substance. Keisha was at the elevator bank with her coat on, coming off night shift. She looked at Margaret and said, "Did you see the statement?" "I saw it." "The part about formal corrections for impacted staff, does that mean—" "Carl Weston gets a letter," Margaret said. "Sandra Pruitt gets a letter. Every person on that list gets a formal correction on record." She paused. "It's not nothing." "No," Keisha said. "It's not nothing." She pressed the elevator button. "How are you? You asked me that yesterday." "I'm asking again." "Still okay," Margaret said. "More so." Keisha nodded, reading whatever was in that answer, then went to her elevator. Margaret went to the stairs. Leon was already in his hospital when she arrived on the 3rd floor, which she'd expected. He'd texted at 7:40 to say he was there and had coffee, and she'd texted back that she'd be in around 8:15, and he'd sent a thumbs up that she found both efficient and endearing. He was in Marcus's room, which was on the 4th floor in the monitored unit, an upgrade from the ER that had happened late the previous evening. Margaret went there first. Marcus was upright in the bed, which was an improvement from horizontal and near death. He had color in his face. He had opinions about the hospital's breakfast options, which he was expressing to Leon with the particular energy of a man whose body has been through something serious and is demonstrating its intention to continue existing through the medium of complaint. He looked at Margaret when she came in and said, "You're the one who stabilized me in the atrium." "And in the ER," she said. "Twice." "I was going to say thank you, but that seems inadequate." "It's adequate." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing look of someone who has been described to him at length and is now comparing the description to the reality. "Leon talks about you like you hung the moon," he said. "I wanted you to know I was going to be skeptical of that." "And now?" "Still skeptical," he said, "but less." Leon said, "Marcus, I'm saying she earned it. That's a compliment." He looked at Margaret. "Most people who've earned something make you feel it. You don't do that." "Noted," she said. "It's a compliment," he said again. Dr. Pallister arrived at 8:50 for the consult. He was a compact, fast-talking cardiologist who thought at the speed of his speech and had the habit of finishing his own sentences differently than he'd started them. He reviewed Marcus's overnight data, asked 3 specific questions, and outlined a medication adjustment that he explained with enough clinical detail that Margaret could follow the reasoning and enough plain language that Marcus could follow it without the clinical background. She liked him for that. The ability to be precise and translatable simultaneously was harder than it looked. The consult took 35 minutes. At the end of it, Pallister said Marcus could be discharged the following morning if his numbers held, which Marcus received with unconcealed relief. "One more night," Leon told him. "I'm aware. You almost died twice yesterday. One more night is—" "I know what it is," Marcus said. "I'm not arguing. I'm just—" He stopped and something crossed his face that wasn't annoyance anymore. "I'm glad it was this hospital," he said quietly. "That's all I was going to say." Margaret looked at the window which faced the east side of the building and was letting in the kind of morning light that made hospital rooms look less like hospital rooms. She thought about the sergeant who'd told Darius Webb this hospital was the best care he'd had since the VA. She thought about the chain of it. Calloway called at 10. The investigation's update was not complete. These things didn't complete in a single day, and Margaret had never expected them to. But the status of its key elements was clearer than it had been the previous evening. Roland Fitch had been formally charged with 4 counts: unauthorized access to personal health information, unlawful interstate transfer of medical records, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice for the security footage deletion attempt. His attorney had entered a not guilty plea that morning as a procedural matter, which Calloway's voice communicated was entirely expected and entirely irrelevant to the strength of the case against him. Harlan Briggs's situation was more complicated and slower, which Calloway acknowledged without apology. The financial connection to the broker was documented. The question of what he had known and when was subject to the investigation's full timeline. His board suspension was immediate. His legal exposure was real. The outcome would take months. "That's going to frustrate people," Calloway said. "The distinction between Fitch's timeline and Briggs's." "Yes," Margaret said. "I want you to hear from me directly that the difference in pace is procedural, not about priority. Briggs is in this. The evidence is being developed in the way that makes it sustainable in a prosecution." A pause. "I've worked cases where people rushed the timeline and built something that fell apart in court. I'm not building something that falls apart." "I believe you," Margaret said. And she did, the way she believed things that were demonstrated rather than performed. Calloway had spent the previous day being precise and honest, and hadn't told Margaret anything that turned out to be wrong. That was a track record, thin as it was, and she was working with it. "The broker," she said. "Their operations. Shut down as of yesterday evening," Calloway said. "Servers seized, principals identified. Their client list is now evidence." A pause. "Your service record material is in the possession of the investigation. When the case concludes, we'll work with the relevant classification authorities to ensure it's properly contained." "Can it be undone?" Margaret said. "The breach." A long pause. "Not fully," Calloway said. "I want to be honest with you. Once something has been accessed, that access can't be retroactively prevented. What we can do is limit further exposure, identify everyone who accessed it, and address the legal consequences of the breach." Another pause. "I know that's not the answer you wanted." "It's the true one," Margaret said. "I'd rather have that." "I know." Calloway's voice changed slightly, more human, less procedural, the register of one woman talking to another rather than an agent briefing a witness. "What he did, what Fitch did with your record specifically, he didn't understand what he had. He saw a military background, classified service, and flagged it as potential leverage without knowing the specific nature of your deployments. The broker understood it more than he did, which is part of what makes the broker a more serious case." A pause. "You should know that the specific capabilities documented in that record, the people who matter professionally in that world already know who you are. The breach didn't change that. It just put your file somewhere it wasn't supposed to be." Margaret sat with that. It was true, and it was partial comfort, and it was the best available version of a thing that shouldn't have happened, which was the category that held most of the uncomfortable truths she'd accumulated over 62 years. True, partial comfort, best available version. She'd built a life on working with that category. She wasn't going to stop now. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be in touch," Calloway said. "This isn't the last conversation." "I know," Margaret said. "I'll be here." Director Noel came to the 3rd floor at 11:30. She didn't send a message ahead. She came herself, in the particular way of someone who understands that some things require personal presence and not delegation, and she found Margaret at the nurse's station reviewing the morning's charts, and she stood on the other side of the counter in a posture that had none of the administrative distance of the previous day's official encounters. "I want to speak with you," Noel said. "I have 12 minutes before rounds," Margaret said. 12 minutes is enough." Noel looked at the counter for a moment, then at Margaret. "I owe you more than an apology for this morning. I owe you an explanation for why Fitch's appointment wasn't scrutinized the way it should have been." She paused. Briggs had significant influence over the hiring decision, more than was appropriate for a board chair. I raised concerns about the candidate review process at the time, and the concerns were documented but not addressed. "Did you document them formally?" "Yes." "Then they're in the record." "They are," Noel said, "which doesn't change that I should have pushed harder." She looked at Margaret directly. "I'm telling you that because you deserve to know it, and because I don't want you to think this is something that only Fitch and Briggs are accountable for. The institutional failure was broader." Margaret looked at her. Noel was 54, had been at Vantage General for 6 years, had a reputation for competence that Margaret had found consistently accurate in their limited direct interactions. She was also a human being who had just spent 24 hours discovering the extent of what had been operating under her directorship. And the toll of that was visible in her face in the specific way that institutional leaders didn't usually let things be visible. "I appreciate you saying that," Margaret said. "It's the truth." "I know." Margaret paused. "What happens to the floor now? Operationally, with the audit underway and the investigation ongoing, the staff here are going to need to know the floor is stable." Noel almost smiled, not with humor exactly, but with the recognition of someone who has just been reminded what priorities look like when they're correctly ordered. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about," she said. "The audit is going to surface gaps in the operational structure that Fitch created. The overtime policy in its current form needs revision. The staffing ratios need review. The reporting structure between clinical and administrative needs clarification." "It needs more than clarification," Margaret said. "Yes." A pause. "I'd like you involved in rebuilding it, not as a committee assignment, as a formal advisory role with compensation and authority commensurate with what you're actually doing." Margaret looked at her. "I'm 62, she said. "I know. I'm not building a new career." "I'm not asking you to build a new career," Noel said. "I'm asking you to help fix what was broken in the one you already had." She paused. "You know this floor better than anyone living. You know what it was before Fitch, and what he changed, and what needs to come back, and what should be different. That knowledge is not replaceable." A pause. "And frankly, after what this institution did to you yesterday morning, I think we owe you the choice." Margaret was quiet for a moment. She thought about Lorraine at the nurse's station, saying people should know with that specific unhedged directness. She thought about Darius Webb in room 318 and the cardiology appointment next Tuesday, and the chain from a sergeant's word of mouth to a young veteran's survival. She thought about the 23 residents who were attendings now, and the specific things she'd given each of them that didn't come from anywhere else, and what it might mean to formalize the conditions under which she kept giving it. She thought about what she'd told Patrick that morning. More so. Still okay, more so. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course. And I need it in writing with specific scope before I agree to anything." "You'll have it this week." "Then I'll think about it this week." Noel nodded. She extended her hand. Margaret shook it, which was not something they'd done before, and it had the quality of something being established rather than maintained. Noel left. Margaret had 9 minutes before rounds. She used one of them standing at the nurse's station, looking at the corridor. The third floor in its morning light. The movement of people who knew what they were doing and were doing it. The particular texture of a place that had been held together through a bad year by the specific stubbornness of the people who worked in it. She used the other 8 reviewing charts, because that was what 9 minutes before rounds was for. Leon was in the lobby at 12:30. Which was where he'd said he'd be, and he had coffee from Pella's because she'd told him she'd take it black, and he'd apparently taken that seriously enough to walk 3 blocks to the source. He handed her the cup when she came off the elevator, and they walked to the seating area near the window without deciding to, the way people go to the same place when they've been talking about enough things that physical direction becomes secondary. "Marcus is comfortable," she said. The overnight was good. Discharge tomorrow morning. I know, I talked to Pallister. He looked at his own coffee. He said something interesting. He said Marcus's autonomic complications have been manageable for years because Marcus is unusually good at reading his own body. He said that kind of self-awareness usually comes from training of some kind. He paused. I didn't tell him Marcus spent 6 years as a special forces medic, but I thought about it. People take their training into everything, Margaret said. It doesn't stop being useful just because the context changes. He looked at her with a particular attention. Is that something you think about? Sometimes, she said honestly. Less than I used to. Why less? She looked at the lobby, the morning's traffic of people coming through, the check-in desk, the light on the glass entrance. Because I've been here long enough that this became the training, she said. Not the second thing. The thing. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Then he said, May wanted to know if she could write you a letter. Margaret looked at him. She's 7, he said. She writes letters to people. Her grandmother, her teacher. She wrote one to the mayor of Fort Harlan about a pothole near her school. He paused. She knows the story of what happened 11 years ago, and she knows we found you, and she asked me if she could write to you. Margaret said, She should know it might take me a while to write back. Leon said, She'll wait. She believed him. She thought about a 7-year-old who wrote letters to mayors about potholes, who had grown up knowing a story about a nurse in a field hospital, who had the patience of someone raised by a man who sat in a parking lot at 6 in the morning rather than give up on something he'd been trying to do for 11 years. She thought the patience made sense. Tell her I'd be glad to hear from her, Margaret said. Something in his face did what it had been doing across the entire previous day, settling into its actual shape, the way things settle when they've been held at the wrong angle for too long and are finally allowed to level. Thank you, he said, for the second time, in a different register than the first. You've said that, she told him. I'll probably say it again. That's fine, she said. I'll hear it. She went back to work. That was the fact of it, the one that didn't have a dramatic shape, but was the truest one. She went back to the 3rd floor and finished her shift and made her rounds and reviewed her charts and talked Lorraine through a documentation process that Lorraine almost had right and needed one specific correction on. She checked on Darius Webb, who was getting restless in the particular way of patients who are well enough to be uncomfortable and not yet well enough to be discharged. She told him Tuesday was close, and he said he knew that, and she said she knew he knew, and he laughed. At 3 o'clock, the formal notifications began going out from the hospital's HR department. The letters Calloway's team had prepared going to every person on Fitch's list. Sandra Pruitt texted Margaret at 3:42. Received the letter. I'm going to frame it. Margaret texted back, don't frame it. Keep it in a file. In case. Sandra texted, you're probably right, thank you. Margaret put the phone back in her pocket. Carl Weston's letter reached him in Portland at 4. He called the hospital's HR line and asked 2 questions and said thank you, and hung up. Margaret heard about it from Calloway, who heard about it from the HR coordinator who'd taken the call. She was told he'd sounded like a man who had put something down and wasn't sure yet what his hands were for. She understood that completely. She'd been putting things down and picking things up all her life. The military career she'd left behind without ceremony. The identity she'd built into Vantage General's bones over 3 decades. The badge she'd unclipped at 5:47 the previous morning and placed on the counter without defense. The things she'd picked up in return. Patrick and his coffee and his patience, and the way he sat across a kitchen table and listened without filling the silences. Darius Webb being alive. Marcus Teller's secondary arrest rhythm that she'd watched stabilize through a gap in a curtain with her hands at her sides because that was the limit of her authority in that moment, and she'd held it anyway. Leon Teller's daughter, who would write a letter that might take Margaret a while to answer. These were not compensations. She'd lived long enough to reject that accounting. The idea that good things balance bad ones, that loss is redeemed by gain. They weren't a balance. They were just the content of a life, carried in parallel, the way weight is carried when you've learned that the alternative is putting it down. And that putting it down means leaving it for someone else to carry or letting it stay on the ground, where it becomes a different kind of problem. She was not a person who could leave it on the ground. She never had been. She finished her shift at 7 and gave report to Fiona with the same completeness as the night before, every patient, every flag, every pending matter. It took 25 minutes because the floor had had a busy afternoon and there was more to cover. She didn't cut it short. She walked out through the main entrance at 7:30. She stood on the hospital steps for a moment in the evening air, which had the clean, specific smell of a city after rain. The parking lot had its evening population. The shift transition traffic, the family visitors, the particular human traffic of a place that is always receiving people at the edge of something. She wasn't afraid of what came next. She'd noticed that somewhere in the previous day, though she couldn't fix the exact moment of it, the fear that had been sitting at the base of everything, the quiet background hum of a woman who had known for 3 years that something in this building was wrong and who had not had the tools to address it and who had spent that time working around it and pretending she wasn't aware of it. That hum was gone. Not because everything was resolved. Briggs's case would take months. The audit would take longer. The independent correction of 31 years' worth of institutional damage wasn't the work of a single extraordinary day. She knew that. But the hum was gone, and in the absence of it, she could hear herself think more clearly than she'd been able to in a while. And what she thought, standing on the hospital steps at 7:30 on an evening that smelled like rain, was this. She had spent 11 years doing something that she could never fully describe in any room where description was possible. She had spent 31 years doing something that didn't announce itself. The daily, unglamorous labor of keeping people alive and making sure the people who kept people alive had what they needed to do it. She had done all of it quietly, not because she lacked the capacity for noise, but because the work itself was its own argument, and she had never been able to see the point of making the argument separately from the work. She had been fired at 5:47 in the morning and been back inside the building by 7. She had walked into the boardroom at 7 in the evening on a phone call that gave her 4 minutes of instruction and held a conversation that changed the shape of what Harlan Briggs thought he was going to accomplish. And she had done it with the same register she used for clinical briefings. And it had been enough. Because the truth was enough when you carried it with the specific steadiness of someone who had been carrying things for a long time and had not yet found anything heavier than she could manage. She was not a hero. She was clear on that. Heroes were a narrative category, and narrative categories were useful to other people and largely irrelevant to the people inside them. She was a woman who had done the work that was in front of her consistently for longer than some of her current coworkers had been alive, and she intended to keep doing it for whatever portion of her remaining professional years made sense. She was not finished. That was the thing she was most sure of, standing on the steps with her coat buttoned and her badge in her pocket, and Patrick's headlights visible in the parking lot where he'd come to pick her up because he'd said the ramp was bad for her knee in wet weather, and she hadn't argued because he was right. She was not finished, and that was not a small thing. It was possibly the largest thing, the one that sat underneath everything else and held the weight of it. She walked down the steps toward the parking lot. Her knee hurt on the second step down, which it always did in cold, damp weather, which it would continue to do for the rest of her life. She adjusted her weight and kept going. Patrick had the engine running and the heater on. She got in the passenger side, and he didn't say anything, just looked at her once in the way that covered everything, and then looked back at the road and pulled out of the parking lot. "Dinner?" he said. "Whatever you have," she said. "I have soup." "Soup is fine." He drove. She looked at the hospital in the side mirror as they pulled out onto the street. The lit windows on the 3rd floor, the main entrance sign, the building that had held 31 years of her life and still owed her nothing and still had everything to do with who she was. She looked at it until the turn took it out of view. She faced forward. The city moved past the windows in its evening version, lights and traffic, and the small continuous business of people living their lives in proximity to each other, the way people do in cities, with varying degrees of awareness of how much the person next to them is carrying and how long they've been carrying it. Some of those people were nurses. Some of them were veterans. Some of them were in the specific situation of understanding that they had been reduced to a manageable size by someone with an interest in managing them, and they hadn't yet had the day where the truth of what they were got to be larger than the lie of what they'd been told. That day was not guaranteed. She knew that. She knew it the way she knew that Darius Webb's ablation might work and might not, that Marcus Teller's autonomic complications would need management for the rest of his life, that Carl Weston might get his nursing director career back or might build something else entirely and might need years to distinguish between those options. She knew it the way she knew everything she'd spent 62 years learning, imperfectly, with full awareness of the gaps, with the specific discipline of a person who had decided that incomplete knowledge was not a reason for paralysis. She knew what she knew, and what she knew was this: the work was worth doing, not because it was always recognized or always safe or always just in its outcomes, because it was the work, the actual work, the irreducible thing that was still there when everything that was supposed to make it easier was stripped away. And you were either the kind of person who did it anyway, or you weren't. She had always known which kind she was. Patrick turned onto their street. The house had its porch light on, the way he always left it when he knew she was coming home after dark. She looked at it, the ordinary specific sight of a light left on for her in a house she'd lived in for 20 years, and felt the full weight of the day settle into something she could carry without it breaking her, which was not the same as it being light, which was the whole point.